attracts customers that people.
Can't figure out how to.
I was just trying to write down the participants here so you all can get your training. This will qualify for toward your 4 hours of education required in a calendar year for planning commissioners and board of zoning appeals members. I think I see John Hoffman here from BZA. Okay. I hope these videos are going to work okay. I had to get some technical help to actually get it to work properly. So we'll give it a shot. But just to give you a little bit of an overview here, the form-based code discussion tonight, we're going to have 3 videos before the regular meeting, and then we'll have 3 after, and they're all about 10 to 15 minutes. And they're all part of a series, so one builds on the other. So I think hopefully by the time we're finished with these 6, you all have a better understanding in general of what form-based codes are. And I know we sent in the packet some questions just to be thinking about as you watch these videos, thinking about maybe the pros and the cons of using something like this. If we did use form-based codes or some kind of form-specific type of zoning, where would we maybe want to consider applying that? Are there things that we currently do in some of our zoning districts that are similar, at least the end result is similar to a form-based code? And basically, I think if we're going to adopt a form-based code or something similar to that, and we pick an area where we want that, it's pretty much, at least from the staff's perspective, for it to function properly, it's going to have to be a requirement for that particular area, because you can't really have 2 very different kind of zoning applications in a targeted area, and it actually produced the end result that we're after, I think. So that's something to think about too as we watch these videos. This is a series that was put together basically for the city of San Rafael in California, but it could apply anywhere. It's presented by Opticos Design, and I think they do a pretty good job of introducing this topic to really, really from scratch. What is it? What are the different components of form-based codes, and how might you put together a code, and what might you want it to contain, and what would be the effect of having that. So with that, I'll go ahead and I get started on the first video. Hopefully you all can hear these. If you have an issue, send me a chat comment, and I'll see what I can do. But we did test it a little while ago, and it sounded like everybody could hear it. So we'll go ahead and get started. And this is the first video. Obviously, the first video is just form-based codes. What are they and how do they work? So with that, I'll turn it over to the speaker.
This is Noah. I want to make sure that I'm not missing something here. Is there anybody talking and I'm screwed up my IT, which I'm pretty good at?
No, I can't see it or hear it either, Noah.
Okay. All right. So I'm not the only one. I feel better then.
Don't see or hear anything.
So y'all are having, you can't hear it. Nobody can hear it.
Yes,
It's not
it's not
showing
playing on
anything
our
the
screens.
Oh,
There's
really?
nothing on the screen, Mark.
Oh. All
Yeah,
right.
we're all just sitting here looking at each other.
Sorry about that.
Waiting for it to start.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see here.
Bart, you might want to mute yourself.
Now there it goes.
Yeah, I see something too.
Okay. So y'all see the screen now? Okay.
Yep, we see
Let me
the
see
screen
if
now.
let me try to get this thing
It's the
to
Farragut
start
Steel
playing.
Works, right?
Yeah, that's it. All right, so I'm gonna start the audio of it, so please let me know if y'all have any trouble hearing this.
Coast Design. I'm here today to talk to you about form-based codes. Specifically, what is a form-based code and how does it work? Thanks for joining us today. So thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk today about how.
And everyone hear that?
Yes.
Can hear it? Okay, good. Thank goodness. Okay. My fault. I must have not had it shared properly. So, all right, that's good. Thank you.
How form-based code works and how it's different than conventional or use-based zoning, the two terms that we'll be referring to a lot today. There we go. Basically, the description of a form-based code is simple. It's these two sentences. A form-based code fosters predictable results in a high-quality public realm by using physical form rather than the separation of uses as the organizing principle for the code. And secondly, a form-based code is a regulation, not a guideline. It's adopted into city, town, or county law, typically in zoning, in the zoning ordinance. But before we go into the form-based code specifics, let's talk about why it came to be and what it's trying to address. So let's understand it by looking at the current system, which is called conventional or use-based. That is a system that was born about 100 years ago out of a serious need to keep bad things from happening and undesirable results, buildings that were out of scale, etc. But it was never a system intended to make anything, and that's really the problem with use-based or conventional zoning. And it's evidenced by these kinds of results that nobody in Somerville would approve, but they're still possible because of the result, the way that conventional zoning is made and the kinds of questions that it asks or doesn't ask. In this case, in these two communities, the zoning didn't even recognize the very character that existed before the zoning code came to be. And if you look closely at aerial photography, you'll notice the sizes of the new buildings, which don't have the tile roofs, the sizes of the older buildings, which have the tile roofs, and they tend to be smaller in footprint, have bigger setbacks, the parking in different locations as compared to the new. And that is a big difference because the numerical approach to the conventional use-based system just didn't take into account the existing character. Another big departure from the form-based code practice is that the conventional use-based approach uses density as the big metric, and it's an important factor, but you can see here these two buildings are completely different, yet they only differ by 1 unit per acre, and yet one building has 60 units and the other one has 5. Same with floor area ratio. It's a very highly used metric in use-based conventional zoning. But here again, you know, the higher the number, the presumption is that it's something that wouldn't be wanted, but yet the duplex on the left has a higher floor area ratio than the three-story building with 12 times the number of units in it. And so the conventional use-based approach does not recognize a lot of realities that exist in our communities. And so this slide shows very simply that there are basically two categories of buildings that the form-based code sees. Buildings that are individually or collectively the size of your block, the blue area, so those are block scale buildings, or buildings that are individually the size of houses and are detached from one another. And these can range from small little cottages to up to mansions. Those are in the purple. Those two categories then fan out into a repeating pattern across the country of many building types. You've heard duplexes and triplexes and courtyard buildings and cottage courts and all kinds of different terms, including townhouses, all the way up to towers on the right, with houses on the left, towers on the right. And these patterns repeat across the country, and they have different names and different variations. But the conventional zoning code, the use-based approach, cannot see this information. That is a very elemental piece and aspect of our communities and built environment. So the form-based approach takes that on and understands those existing characteristics, and then goes through a public process to prepare a vision, a physical vision that is highly specific to an area and based on the sizes of those lots, based on the community intentions and expectations over the next 20, usually 20 to 30 years. And these principles are applied through the process. And I won't read them because they're on the screen, so I'll just give you a couple seconds to go through these. So those 5 principles lead into the practice of making form-based codes, and the essential elements of a form-based code are 5. There is a regulating plan of building form standards, frontage type standards, civic space standards, and thoroughfare standards, and we'll get into those here next. The first one is a regulating plan. It's basically what I like to call a 3-dimensional zoning map. And it's 3-dimensional because the conventional or use-based approach to zoning only maps the uses that are allowed and the heights in the zoning district, essentially, and sometimes the setbacks. The regulating plan is different. It maps those things for sure, but it also maps the physical character and the relationships between buildings and the urban design intentions of the plan. So if you look at this this plan for a small downtown carefully, you'll see that the darker colors are going to mean buildings of more intensity, more height, more lot coverage, closer to the front, usually shaping mixed-use streets. And the colors that are lighter, the pink and the lighter blue there, they are indicating buildings that are detached from one another, have lower lot coverage, are smaller in scale, smaller in height, and have less intense uses, usually in neighborhoods. And then you can see other indications on there that show urban design intentions at particular corners or in particular streets. So the regulating plan is very important, and it does far more than the regular zoning map. And then the building form standards are important because they talk about the sizes of buildings, the height of buildings, the height of ground floors along particular streets to keep or generate a particular character, how big the buildings can be front to back, which is usually not regulated by conventional codes, how wide they can be on particular lots, again, to keep in with the existing pattern or a pattern that you want to make. And then where the parking needs to go in order to make all this work. There are a lot of codes that do a lot of things right, but they don't get the parking right. And so the parking often detracts from the physical character that would otherwise be great. And then frontage standards, these are very, very important as they shape and and really detail the ground floor of each building to do its part to shape the public realm. Keep in mind that the form-based code is very focused on generating a public realm that you want to be in. Can cars be in that public realm? Sure. If it's a street that accommodates cars, yes. But pedestrians and cyclists also are expected to be on that street. And you know what it's like to walk past a building or a ground floor that architecture aside, but just the blank windows or big blank walls. And so this section of the code provides standards to make sure that public realm and the ground floors are appealing and interactive. Next are the civic space standards, which are small gathering spaces that are not nature, they're not open space out in the country. They're plazas, greens, squares, passages, things like that, that connect the public realm of streets with other areas and maybe sometimes even within blocks. And then lastly, thoroughfare standards. These are standards that capture all the different types of thoroughfares, from boulevards and avenues and main streets to neighborhood streets to roads, all those different thoroughfares, and how they pass by the lots that they're serving is very, very important. That needs to be in balance. So those are part of a form-based code, where in conventional or use-based practice, those are a separate domain, and depending on the relationship between the different departments, that's either a good thing or not a good thing. I think in San Rafael, it's actually working well, and to have these standards will only help things. So it's working well, but it'll work better with these standards. We want to make sure that it's clear that form-based codes are not intended for everywhere. This slide is showing a typical community where form-based codes can be applied. That is in the purple area, the darkest purple area, the walkable urban, or you'll hear the walkable neighborhood name. And those are areas that tend to have short blocks, usually under 600 feet in length, highly interconnected block pattern, giving you multiple routes to the same destination, different choices to get to the same place, and amenities to walk to from your place of work or where you live. And the other areas, the suburban pattern, the approach there is intentionally to separate everything. And that's the way people want it in those areas. And so form-based codes don't really offer a lot for areas like that, because the form-based code is trying to mix things and provide proximity, and the suburban pattern is the opposite. The transitional pattern are those areas that would otherwise be walkable, but they're missing the amenities to walk to. So they can be retrofitted to be walkable. A couple things here about repeating structure. I love to use this example of the anatomy of this girl's face that we all share. Every one of us shares this, and we all are unique in our own ways, and thankfully so. But communities share anatomy too, and that's what the conventional or use-based code does not recognize, this repeating structure. And so this soundboard analogy is to show you that the form-based code takes all the elements of a community, as few or as many characteristics that make your community and the character that you like, or if it doesn't exist that you want to generate, it lets you choose them and then lets you coordinate them. So take, for example, all these different subjects, and at the left-hand end of this board, you can see the question mark and then just indicating that you could add more. But the idea is that, as in the recording engineer sound booth, what they're doing is they're coordinating different aspects, different factors of a group, let's say, vocalist, horns, percussion, and so on, to coordinate it for one effect, for a coordinated sound that they want. Well, a zoning district and form-based code is the same way. Using this analogy, you can dial up or dial down these different characteristics for particular outcome, a physical place outcome in your code. And I think it's really powerful to understand that about form-based codes, because there's a misunderstanding that somehow they they either come with 1,000 different regulations or none, and that's very far from the truth. The truth is you can choose as few or as many to regulate, and depending on your physical character, you need to figure that out. And so this slide goes to that, and it identifies the range of standards that you could regulate, and there are more, but the range of standards that for this example on the left in that column, and then 5 scenarios of expectations. So the light blue outline around the gray is a basic level of regulation. The medium is shown in gray, and then the highest level of regulation is shown in black. And the idea is that there are 2 levels to this. One is, which regulations do you need to achieve the effects that you want? And number 2, to what level do you need to regulate that element to achieve what you want? And the form-based code lets you do this because it sees all the physical character in your community. It's like a radar looking for all these elements, and it's up to you to turn them on or off, depending on your policy expectations and your community expectations. Lastly, there's a big responsibility to teach about this because it's such a departure from the prevalent conventional use-based approach that there are a lot of questions and misunderstandings, and clearly over 20 years of practice, we've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work. And so we're the first to tell you that there's a lot to be taught about it and a lot to be explained. So anyway, thank you for your time today. We look forward to hearing from you on your questions, and really enjoy talking about this with people, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any specific comments or observations dealing with this first video that you want to share before we start the second one?
Hi.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start the next one. This next video builds on the first one, and this is called the regulating plan. So this talks in more specifics about the regulating plan that was mentioned very briefly in the first video. So with that, we'll get started on this one.
Hey, I'm Tony Perez with Opco's Design, and I'm here to take you through session number 2 in this series about form-based codes. Today's session is about the regulating plan. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us today on this session about the regulating plan. The 3-dimensional zoning map, as I like to call it. The regulating plan, it's best understood to talk about it in terms of scale first. How big of a form-based code and regulating plan can you apply? And this slide shows you the 3 different scales, general scales. The site-specific, usually a downtown or a small-town main street or a particular neighborhood. Then the second one is multiple areas, might be several corridors or several neighborhoods. And then the third scale is all the walkable areas of an entire community. As we mentioned in the first part, a form-based code isn't applied to an entire community. It's only applied to the areas where walkable type of development and proximity uses and mixing of uses, mixing of housing choices is what is expected. So the hybrid puts together the zoning for form-based areas and the zoning that exists for conventional or use-based areas. Then the next step is to understand the types of regulating plans. So we talked about the scales, but the types of regulating plans are another thing. So for infill or preservation situations where there's an existing pattern, very strong existing physical character, then that type of regulating plan, which we'll talk about in the next segment here, that's what you need to use. Where there's an area with some development, but a lot of vacant land or land that's going to be repurposed, then regeneration type of regulating plan is appropriate. When there's no pattern, in the case of Greenfield, there's nothing yet. It's a brand new community, brand new area. Then the Greenfield regulating plan is the one to use. So let's talk about that one first. The Greenfield regulating plan, as all regulating plans do, they identify the zones. In this particular case, they identify the approximate locations of new streets with the indication that more streets are going to be developed to fill out the network, but at the big scale, the important streets and the important connections are identified here, and then boundaries of natural areas not to be developed. The next aspect of a Greenfield regulating plan is the civic and open space network, and it can be broken down into as much or as little detail as necessary, but this shows 3 different types of open spaces, all the way from actual nature to civic spaces inside the neighborhoods. And then the third level of third component of the Greenfield regulating plan is the thoroughfare network. So as we mentioned in the first session in this series, there are lots of thoroughfares that are not just streets, roads, avenues, boulevards, passages, and all kinds of neighborhood streets. So this map would show all those and show the primary connections, and then future connections you can see outlined there in gray. The second type of regulating plan is a regeneration regulating plan, where again the idea is there's an existing pattern to build upon or to build within in gaps in existing areas, as is shown in this slide. And so the regulating plan completes the block and street network and identifies new zones for those new blocks. The second part of this regulating plan identifies the civic spaces within those new blocks or along those new blocks, and then new connections for pedestrians, bicycles, and vehicles. And then the last portion of it, similar to the Greenfield approach, is the thoroughfare component of the regulating plan. And this shows existing streets and or new streets to be retrofitted, where the Greenfield regulating plan is showing entirely new streets and new blocks and everything. The regeneration regulating plan is fitting into an existing system and building upon it, or making some changes to the existing system. The third type of regulating plan is the infill development type, and this one, all the blocks are exist. The lots exist. The buildings exist. There's a lot that already is developed and contributes to the existing physical character and the way that the people enjoy the place. So the vision here is to when you work with a community, the vision is to work to identify what the intended changes are, or what is intended to be maintained and preserved. For example, there might be physical character on an existing street that is just wonderful, and people don't want any change. They want new investment, but they want that new investment to fit into that pattern. So change there means new investment fitting physically and sensitively into the existing pattern that people love so much. So this type of regulating plan tends to have more information in it as compared to the other two, because there's more to fit into. So to put them into scale, the Greenfield regulating plan is starting entirely from scratch. The regeneration regulating plan is recognizing that there's some existing characteristics there, and some are to remain, some are to be adjusted. And then the infill regulating plan, it's at the other end of the spectrum. It's usually recognizing much or all of the physical character that exists, and it's not changing it. It's actually making new development fit into that pattern. And so this type of regulating plan will tend to have more information and more detail in its code, in its zone standards. And you can see here that the particular types of information that it contains. And as a detail on that, you can see that the urban design intentions of this particular vision are calling out special requirements at certain corners, certain passages through blocks in certain locations, and new civic spaces that are expected over the life of this plan, which is about 20 years. Other indications as well, for example, in certain areas of a zone says 4 stories are allowed in the zoning district. In certain areas, to be compatible with adjacent development, 3 stories are allowed. It drops at a story. Or there might be additional instructions about the length of buildings in certain areas where maybe the zoning district allows the buildings to be, say, 100 feet long and 60 feet wide. In particular areas in that same zoning district, maybe this map shows an indication that says those buildings need to be only 60 feet long and 60 feet wide so that they fit in with the buildings in that particular block. So instead of changing the entire zoning district, you can show in a map like this instructions like that refer to a portion of the code with particular standards. The other thing that's common through all of these is that in a regulating plan and form-based code, the colors are indicative of intensity and in buildings and in uses. So whenever you see a regulating plan, the darkest color means the most intense uses, the broadest list of uses, and the most intense use of those lots. For example, buildings in the dark zone here are indicated that they use most of their lot. They tend to be attached. They tend to be toward the front or at the sidewalk, shaping usually a mixed use or Main Street type of environment. At the other end of the spectrum, in the pink zone, those buildings are detached. They're a lot smaller in footprint, tend to be 2 to 3 stories, have big front yards and big rear yards, and decent size setbacks on the side. And then the uses are far less in those zones. They're still allowing mixed uses, but there are far less of them, or fewer of them, and in smaller sizes. And that's a particular aspect of regulating plans that the expectation is you can see the zoning map here, the regulating plan, and get a good picture and a good understanding without even looking at the code of the types of intensities and arrangements and uses that are allowed. The power of the regulating plan is that, just like in the form-based code, you can choose as much or as little detail to put onto the regulating plan, but at its core, you want to identify the zoning districts and then any other particular standards. For example, you can see here this little black arrow shown in a couple of new locations in this particular example of where at a certain project size, where a new street to break up that large super block would be required. So you can put all kinds of information on these regulating plans, and it really just depends on the vision that you're implementing, and that's key. You're always going back to the vision. This is, again, a big departure from conventional use-based approach, where it is more about preventing and limiting, which is certainly part of the equation, but the other part of the equation is, what do you want to generate once you've identified what you want to prevent and what you want to limit? What do you want to generate? What do you want to make? So this tool helps you do that. That's all we have for today on the regulating plan. I really encourage your questions. I encourage you to look at these videos and study them and I look forward to talking with you. Thank you.
Okay, before before we start the third video, does anybody have any questions, comments, observations? I know this is a lot of detail and very different from what we and most communities do, I guess, with their land use and zoning. I think really to me the take that I get from this is that it's really your visioning, your community visioning is the critical component here. And you really need to, if you want to implement this, figure out where you think you might want it, what's that priority area, and really get that community visioning to establish what products do you want built and what do you want them to look like and how they will relate to that physical space. And that takes a lot more planning and visioning and just a lot of engagement, which is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. But it's it's basically going to be largely a visioning effort to get a plan put together, a form-based code put together, or whatever you end up putting together that actually will execute that vision on the ground. Does anybody have anything you want to say about this so far, or comments?
Mark, I'm just going to add a little bit of my thoughts. Seems to me that we would probably limit this to our mixed-use town center, mostly because that's the walkable environment we're trying to establish. And I guess what I'm hearing from him saying is form-based code is regulation. My biggest concern is protecting the existing residential that surrounds the area that's to be developed in our mixed-use town center. My first impressions is it seems that we would be able to build in and have a regulatory recipe or design or plan that the citizens or the residents in the surrounding areas can rely on and feel confident that they don't have to be up in arms every time something new comes along that needs to be worked through the planning commission, that there's a set plan that we've worked through with especially the citizens that are the residents that are most directly impacted. Is that accurate, what I'm saying?
Yeah, it does provide for a lot more predictability than traditional zoning, because it really establishes the form of the built environment. So yeah, I think that's a major benefit of the form-based code. And I'm not a proponent, or I'm not really trying to say yay or nay on this. We're just providing you with information. But generally, it will provide for much more predictability, which would help, with concerns that people may have about different projects. So I think that's a major benefit, because in a way, it's kind of like the pre-approved planned unit development that's referenced in our plan. It's basically, there's been an engagement with the community, and this is how we want it to build out, and what we want it to look like, and how we want it to relate to within itself and to its surroundings, and basically somebody just needs to go and build it, basically. So you've taken out all of the uncertainty. You know exactly what the end product is going to generally look like, and that is a major benefit of form-based codes, because in zoning, it's more focused on the uses, as opposed to how the buildings relate to their surroundings, and that's a compatibility issue. You know, you can have a zoning district that allows a very different kind of use adjacent to something else, and that can create a lot of incompatibility potential, and that's what gets, you know, the public all worked up, is that traditional zoning doesn't give you that level of predictability that something like this would.
One question I would have to think about going forward would be also how you to bring the development community along with it, because it's one thing to have a great plan, but if you can't build it or nobody's interested in building it, then how do you execute it? So it's with a change in approach, it looks like you've got the citizens as well as the developers. There's all kind of stakeholders that have to go be involved in going down that path. I can see it for certain areas. I don't see it for large areas because a lot of that's already kind of the die is cast. But I'm also interested in the execution end of it as well as just the planning end. That's all.
Yeah,
Mark,
that's a great point, because obviously there's no point in going through an exercise of creating a code that nobody's going to ever build to. So obviously you'd have to, and that's part of the visioning. The visioning is the visioning of all actors, all parties. You know, it's the residents, it's the property owner, it's the developer, it's, you know, all kinds of different perspectives that come together to, you know, work on this kind of a code. And there's going to have to be, you know, obviously some compromise with certain groups, I think, inevitably. But yeah, we would have to, you know, make sure that if we went down this route, that we didn't create something that you know, no one would want to do because it's just not practical. It's not realistic.
Mark, this is John Green. First of all, is this something that you're actually considering, or are you just presenting this so that we're aware of form-based codes?
Well, we're just presenting it. We presented this to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen in January, just as a short workshop, and you know, we're kind of looking at transitions. You know, that's talked a lot about in our plan, and different approaches to try to add some predictability in our development regime, and then, you know, try to figure out ways to provide for, you know, good transitions in different developments. And like Louise said, particularly the mixed-use town center is an area. But no, we're not necessarily saying that this is something we want to adopt, or we're just providing you all with information. I think the board, Mayor and Alderman, had asked the staff to put this before the Planning Commission just to get your all's thoughts on this. And you know, at least it may provide us with some ideas that where you know, you could incorporate some kind of a hybrid approach that would, you know, have the visioning and, you know, kind of get a feel for how you want your form to be in different contexts, and, you know, and build the regulatory regime in that manner. Because we got some elements of form-based codes. I mean, it's in a couple of our zoning districts, like the community service, you know, with the Village Commons senior living community, where the buildings on the periphery have to be, you know, the same general form as what they abut. So, you know, that's kind of this in general the same end result of a form-based code. And form-based codes are, you know, can be whatever the community wants them to be. It's not like this speaker has said before, I think, is there's not a one size fits all approach here. It can be very simple and limited, or it can be pretty comprehensive, and you know, and it's really up to the community to decide, you know, if they want to apply this and how and in what manner they would want to do so.
From just looking at these couple of videos that we've seen so far here, it seems more complex. We've grown up with, we have a lot of different zones, but we have several basic zones. We have residential zones, we have commercial zones, we have agricultural zones, which give us an indication of kind of what we want. This one seems more complicated. Maybe it's just because it's new. But as Ed was saying, I'm kind of curious of what Noah Myers thinks of this approach, because it looks to me like it kind of cramps the style of the developer a little bit. Noah, you got any comments?
Yeah, I've been familiar with it since the city of Knoxville did the recode, which was basically an effort to incorporate form-based zoning. And I think and that we've discussed this, and the videos discussed it. It really works well in denser, more urban environments. And I think we've got a couple of zoning districts that I think would be real applicable. Obviously, the TCD, or somehow tying it in with the MUTC. You know, maybe the new the small neighborhood commercial, the zone that we kind of created that I think was less than 25,000 square foot. I mean, there are some things where I think it works. I'm trying to get my arms around. When the city of Knoxville did it, they basically recoded all their zones, and most of their zones kind of stayed the same. And I think that's kind of how it would work for us, is most of our zones and some of the philosophies that we've used. I think that I think most of that stuff's going to stay the same. You know, being all the turmoil that we've all dealt with and seen over the past 6 months with the apartments, you know, there's a lot of folks that are very traditional in how they want to see Farragut, and I think that form-based zoning really is real appropriate when you're mixing uses and you're more focused on the what the building looks like than you are on the exact uses in the building. And I don't know, I'm kind of, the verdict's still out with me about how the city of Knoxville is ultimately going to be able to utilize it as much as they'd like. Obviously, some of the revitalization areas, the Magnolia Corridor, it makes a ton of sense, and trying to do some things, but I'm struggling of how really applicable it would be in the town of Farragut.
Yeah, and how advantageous it would be. It sounds like it would be a complicated process to transition from what we have now to form-based codes. And
well,
so
not necessarily, because I think most of our zoning districts would pretty much stay the same, kind of like in the city of Knoxville. A lot of their office districts are still office, the residential districts are still residential districts. It's those areas that are more urban or would have the opportunity to mix uses. And I think in a way we've kind of done this with the MUTC, having that overlay zone. And we've kind of done it to a certain degree. It is real intriguing. It's relatively new form-based codes. I say it's new, at least it's new to us in East Tennessee. For all I know, the West Coast has been doing it for 20 years. And when you look at form-based codes, you see a lot of it, it's Portland, Oregon. Well, Portland, Oregon is very different from Farragut, Tennessee. And, there, they have a lot of density and, apartments, that's a big thing. And as we've seen, some of these things I think are going to be challenging to try to get the rest of the community on board when we implement, based upon our experience, like I said, in the last 6 months with some of the projects we've seen in front of us.
Just to add to that, that's why I know that we've kind of discussed it from a board level. The concern we've talked about in our staff developer meetings is how we are going to mix this mix of uses when you have existing development already there. I would not support doing this townwide. We're 80% built out. The commercial corridors are going to be the commercial corridors. we may be able to see a mix of uses, but we could probably, you know, we've built that into neighborhood convenience commercial. The biggest tracks left are R1, probably going to be our open space residential. And I think that that works perfectly fine out there. I think the biggest concern for us from the board's perspective, and I hate to speak for everyone else, but this is kind of, this is what I'm kind of digesting, I've heard, is how are we going to deal with the rest of the town center, that even the stuff that's not technically in the mixed use town center, but is certainly proximate to it, the large piece of property, the Biddle property, I know is challenging from a topography standpoint, but we kind of have to have a reasonable plan. And I think the residents, especially the ones in Park Place and Glen Abbey, are very concerned about what does that look like. And if they had some definitive plan, I think they would feel a lot more comfortable about going forward. And so what does that look like? And I guess that's what the appeal to me is from that perspective, is the regulatory, but I would not support a town-wide, and if it falls because we don't do it town-wide, then I'm fine with that. And we can stick to our PCD and our TCD and do our mix of uses in those zoning ordinances. But I think that's where it was coming from, was this concern that form matters, and that compatibility of form, but how do you mix those uses? And I guess that's what's driven this conversation.
Yeah, this is Mark. I think the first thing from my perspective as a planner is I would, you know, engage the public and identify what are the concerns, if you focus on the mixed use town center area, you know, and lay out those kind of the transition concept and all that stuff, get those out on the table, and then you kind of evaluate that and figure out how best to address that in a regulatory manner that is, you know, allows for the development of property, but it also provides protection to address, you know, concerns that are expressed for, you know, new developments, particularly those that abut existing residential developments. So, I mean, and that would kind of lay the groundwork for how would be the best way to approach that. You know, would it be through some kind of form-based code, or would it be just some additional language in your existing zoning districts? And there's all kinds of different ways to do that, but you have to understand what people are concerned about in order to know what you need to try to provide for. And to me, that would be the first. And like I said, visioning is a good thing about this code, and I think that needs to happen in any kind of ordinance. And we did that when we adopted our plan in 2012, and we've done it since then in different priority areas. And it's just a matter of you know, incorporating that again. And you know, it's obviously been a challenge for the last year. None of us had any control over, but that's going to have to be a key element in this. We'll go ahead and get started on the third video, and we can take some additional comments after this and get ready for the regular meeting.
Hi, I'm Tony Perez, and welcome to session 3 on form-based zones. Session 1 was about what is a form-based code and how does it work. Session 2 was on the regulating plan, which implements a form-based code. And this session is about the zones that are on a regulating plan and go into the zoning code itself. So thanks for joining us, and look forward to this with you. So thanks for joining us for this session. We are going to be talking about the zoning districts that implement a form-based code. You'll hear them called a variety of things, but form-based zones is the simplest term. And remember from the regulating plan video, the form-based zones are mapped directly onto the parcels that implement the vision. So and that are involved in the plan that the code is implementing. So remember, the form-based code and the form-based zones are not guidelines. They're not advisory. The regulations, they're zoning, just like you have right now. It's just they're much more informed standards, and they're relative to a particular vision. And remember how we talked about the color having to do with intensity and scale and size. So this diagram, this regulating plan shows very clearly the lighter colors, meaning the less intense zones, which have detached buildings, in this case, mostly houses and duplexes and fourplexes and buildings like that. Mostly residential uses with a few non-residential uses limited by size. So buildings in these zones tend to use less of their lot. They're detached, they have big front yards and backyards. In the darker zones, it's the opposite. The buildings are taller, they use more of the lot, they're either near or at the sidewalk, and they're shaping mixed use or other type of Main Street environments. So the zones can be read very easily here on this regulating plan to understand the intent. You can see where the darker colors are intending for more intensity, more activity, and the lighter colors are intending for neighborhood type of scale and activity. So when you write a form-based code, you look at the vision, you prepare a regulating plan that maps the zones, and then you start to look at the physical character that your vision and your existing built character indicate that you are to continue or to change. In this case, we're continuing it, and new investment is fitting in to the existing pattern. And so there are a number of characteristics here on the right. You can see this qualitative set of statements talking about building size and whether the buildings are detached or attached. The building width in terms of along the front, and the length, whether the setbacks are small, medium, or large, or whether the building footprint itself is small, medium, or large. And then the height and number of stories, and then sometimes there's information at this level for the ground floor ceiling height. Depending on the characteristics, there may be a need to identify a certain ground floor height other than just the minimum allowed by the building code. And then how those buildings relate to the street, whether they're through front yards, porches, stoops, dooryards, or in the case of Main Streets, shop fronts, and another type of non-residential frontages. And then a little statement about use. This zone is primarily residential with neighborhood supporting uses in buildings at corners. And the intent statement below, and the intent statement you'll see is very physically oriented as opposed to the conventional use-based approach, which can't be very specific because it's not sure what it's generating. And that's not a criticism, it's just a fact that the form-based zone is completely intentional about the environment it's trying to generate or trying to preserve and make new investment fit into that pattern. So the intent statement here actually talks about the type of environment, including the building sizes and the housing choices that are expected in this environment or allowed if they don't already exist. So you do that for each zone on your regulating plan that you're going to put into the code, and then you do it for do the same thing for each one of them. And in this case, the zones are all in one family of intensity, and I'm going to explain that on the next set of slides. They're all in what we call the T4 level of community character. And so you see here the name of the zones is very physically oriented. It's telling you and showing you in a diagram what kind of physical character is intended. either to be generated from scratch or to be maintained with new investment. And so the name of the zone, again, the level is T4, and I'll explain that on the next slide, but the level is T4, the type of zone is neighborhood. And then a particular characteristic about this first one on the left is that the buildings have a small footprint. So the zone name is T4 neighborhood small footprint, or T4NS for short. The middle one on the screen goes up in intensity, but not too much. The buildings get a little bigger, and that's why we call it medium footprint, but they're still in that T4 level of intensity. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the third zone in this particular code, and it's a Main Street zone, still at that T4 level of intensity. The buildings are a little bigger, but they're only 3 stories tall, with a 4-story allowed at the corners, and they have that scale of the typical American small town Main Street. So a couple points here. One is that things are very physical in the form-based code. They're very visual. You can see and understand the type of scale and intensities that the code is implementing and allowing. And the names need to indicate the type of environment that is intended, as opposed to euphemisms like in a lot of codes where you hear the terms urban, low, residential. That can mean a lot of different things, especially if it's not graphically explained. And so form-based code uses the name of the zoning district itself to communicate the expected intensity and physical character. Then each zoning district is implemented through development and use standards that can look a lot of different ways. These are pages from a code that we wrote recently. In a subsequent session in this series, we'll get into all those details, but this is what those pages look like. They have all the development standards. And contrary to a lot of, there's a lot of misunderstanding about form-based codes and what they do and don't regulate. And one of the misunderstandings is that they don't regulate use, and that just isn't true. They do regulate use. Again, they're zoning standards. So the T4 that you heard me mention earlier, that comes from a system called the transect. And the transect is a very simple system rooted in biology. It's rooted in research that actually was started a couple hundred years ago, and about probably 30 years ago, the research started being called the transect. There were a lot of scientists doing work in identifying where a certain species could thrive and where they didn't thrive. And so the originators of the transect took that theory and said, well, let's do that for humans and towns and villages and cities, and develop a system that we can all communicate with simply. And so the idea is that there are 6 transects started from nature and rural or the country, and then T3 neighborhoods of lower intensity, mostly single family nature, but other houses and other types allowed, and then T4 less single family, if any, and mostly duplexes, fourplexes, courtyard buildings, things like that. And then T5, it's usually places that are bigger footprint buildings, both residential and non-residential. And T6 is very rare. Downtown Oakland here in the Bay Area, downtown San Francisco, big areas, or now as it's emerging downtown Berkeley would be in T6. And then the special district are harbors, airports, industrial areas, things that will never be neighborhoods. And so at Opticos, we've taken it a step further, and we've just said, the T1 and T2 are places that you don't develop in. That's the reason for identifying them this way. And so they're off the table. They're to be preserved. Where you make towns and villages are in T3 through T6. And in most cases, T6 doesn't even happen. So we're really talking about T3, T4, and T5. And so these next couple slides are just to show examples of applying this approach to real places. Here's a place in the Midwest, Iowa City. where we're currently working, and you can see the system applied to that existing community. And not all communities have all parts of the transect. Some places don't have any nature or country, or they don't have any T6, but most places have T3, T4, and T5. For example, here is my hometown in the Delta, Ileton, and it only has a couple, I mean, it's 1,000 people. It's a miniature town, but you can see the transect is here. They don't use it as their system of zoning, but the transect is latent. It's there. It's just whether or not you recognize it and use it. You can see there's a little main street, there are a couple of neighborhoods, and then there's the country. Carmel, you can see the nature along the shore, a couple of T3 neighborhoods, the little village scale main street that everybody loves. So it's a T4 main street, a couple of T4 neighborhood areas flanking it, and then a couple of T3 neighborhood areas. And then just roughly looking at San Rafael, using this system, again, this is just a generalization. It's not precisely applied here. It's for the idea to communicate that the transect does exist and is in this community. It just hasn't been used yet, and we're proposing to use it in the code that is implementing the precise plan. So you take that approach, you identify the zoning districts, and you identify these qualitative statements about the character of the area, and then you come up with numbers and standards for your zoning code. And it's really important to understand that these qualitative statements that are on these little tables next to the physical character of each zone, they're the link between the policy document and the zoning standards themselves. You know, why is it, like somebody will come in 7 years later, 5 years later and say, you know, I'd like to change the site setback from 7 to 5 or from 5 to 7. And instead of needing to go back through the policy document and wade through all the direction of that document, what we found is it's just as effective to actually set up these statements in here as a link. And when somebody says, I'd like to change the setbacks to X, you have some direction here. You can look at this statement that preceded the zoning district, and it says, well, in the T4 neighborhood medium footprint zone, it says the setbacks are small to medium. And so we know that small is 0 and medium isn't 25 feet. So somewhere between 5 and 10, 5 and 12, you know, it's fine. But if somebody comes in and asks for a change that isn't consistent with that policy direction, that qualitative statement, you have something to go with. So that's the intent of these statements here. And in the next section, we'll talk about the details that come out of these qualitative statements and have come out of mapping these zoning districts, which are trying to implement a vision. So thanks for watching today, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session and looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any comments on that? Questions?
Hi.
Yeah, this is John Green. I have a comment.
John.
It looks to me like if fully implemented, this would be almost a precise tool for the planner, because it provides a lot of definition, and to develop that definition, it takes vision. But it would be a total enigma to the citizen, because he wouldn't have a clue what all these T4s and T2s and T3s and NMS and all that stuff. It would just just wouldn't understand any of it. It's bad enough that we have commercial residential, then we have different kinds of residential and different kinds of commercial, but at least people can kind of guess as to what's going on. So it looks like, again, for a planner, and back to what Louise was saying, if you were starting from scratch, maybe this would be a good thing to do and grow up with it. But for a town like ours that's 80% developed, it would seem to be a lot of work and a lot of complication, and not enough benefit to help us much. That's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Mark. Yeah, as I said earlier, the form-based code can be tailored and patterned for your community. It's not a one size fits all, but I think the thing I would take away is, and this is just a training session, so again, we don't have to move forward with any of this. This is just information, but the concepts of the end result, I think, are of value, and thinking about how you want the built environment to look in different areas, and how that you want them to function as a place, as opposed to just a subdivision or a development. So I think some of the concepts that are inherent to the end result of form-based codes are useful, and there's certainly more simple ways to try to create a regulatory environment that would kind of more or less give you the same end result without, I agree with you, even as a planner, some of this stuff is very complicated to me because I haven't worked in form-based codes. I've had a lot of training sessions about it, but I haven't actually applied it on the ground. And I would, if I were asked to look into this for this community, I would, try to, whatever approach we end up with, we need to identify again what are the issues we're trying to address, and then what tools do we have to most simply address that. And it may be we might take some components from form-based codes and build them into kind of a more traditional zoning application and keep it kind of as simple to understand as possible. That would probably be the way I would approach it if it were just me. But yeah, I think these things can get extremely complicated, and I would not want to try to, propose something that no one would understand. Obviously, that would be an issue.
Mark, I'd like to add a little bit of perspective to what you're saying. We have our zoning ordinances, and I think people struggle to understand them as well. The layperson doesn't. We talk R1, R1 OSR, R2, R3. We say these things, and people just kind of look at you like, well, what does that mean? So, but there is flexibility within those zoning ordinances. And I'll give my current situation as an example. Now, I always knew that there would be, I back up to Ivy Farms. I always knew there would be a development there. What I never pictured was that I'd have a road directly behind my house. But that's the flexibility of the zoning ordinance. They don't apply with a concept plan. They get the rezoning because it certainly R1 OSR makes sense. And then they lay out the according to how it works for them, and the residents around it don't have a lot of say in if they're meeting the standards, and they're meeting the standards, and I have a road now. So I guess that's the predictability of a form-based code to me. And I'm looking just at the town center. There's something very comforting about being able to look at that from a resident's perspective. Say if you live in Glen Abbey, and you know what's going to come in behind you, and you know what's not going to come in behind you. So can we do that in a zoning ordinance? Can we make that happen in a zoning ordinance where we know that we're protecting and we're providing to them an asset? Because at the end of the day, our mixed-use town center isn't just about making it walkable for the people that live in the mixed-use town center. It's about connecting all of the existing residential around it into it. And of course, it's going to have to be something that they want to come to, or feel good going to, or we've failed miserably. So I guess I'm just trying to find a way that brings more predictability for the residents that are directly impacted by any development that we do in the mixed use town center, and including Village Green. The Village Green Shopping Center is part of this mixed use town center. How does that develop out and impact the residents that live close to it in the Village Green side? So that just kind of gives you a few other things to think about.
This
is
is Ed.
Oh, go ahead, Ed.
I think your earlier remarks, and certainly echo some of the elements of what Louise says, but I think it's the key part to deal with this is how can we, draw in beginning with the end in mind type mindset, and it stimulates the thinking of what is your true vision as opposed to going down just a zoning discussion. But with it, using the current framework that we have with our zoning, to how can we deal with the elements that might make sense in this? I can't see us doing, shifting gears and doing a whole recode or whatever type of effort. I mean, it's just not worth the effort, number one, and the time to implement something like that. But how can we use this as a stimulation to begin with the end in mind type approach in our thinking?
Well, something we might want to look at, this Mark, is as I mentioned earlier, you could think about some of these form-based concepts, and what you could do is if the community objective is to provide for, let's say, provide proper transition to existing developed communities, then you could have let's say 100-foot from those communities, you could create a transitional form that new structures would have to fit within, so that you've got, essentially, you'd be platting building envelopes within that space that new buildings would have to fit within, and you'd want to think about their relationship not only to the existing communities but also internally, and what's their relationship to new streets in that development, so that you're creating kind of a sense of place within the community, and you're transitioning properly to existing developments that may surround that property. So that's one option, where you could have a transitional form area where you have a zoning district that does abut existing, in this case, residential communities, so that form is specified, and where the buildings need to fit within, and you kind of where their placement's generally going to be, because you got these boxes that are platted within which each building has to fit within. But then there's some flexibility within the box for the buildings to float around, as long as they don't, get outside of the box. So that's one kind of hybrid approach that we could consider, like in the mixed use town center, and that would give us some predictability, at least on these transitional areas. And then you want to think about, once you get out of that transitional area, what do you want the remaining space to look like, and how do you want it to relate to your transitional space? And then those are kind of really in line with concepts that are in our current plan, where you transition internally, but when you get to the property lines, basically what you have is compatible with each other.
This is excuse me, this is John Hoffman, and I can see the advantages that might come from this, in the sense that, to use Louise's argument, that when you get a big surprise, that's not good. In my neighborhood, when an office zone ended up accepting 2 restaurants, that was a big surprise. But the reality is, until you've been burned, you don't understand why you might need this. And the idea that we could persuade somehow either the residents of the town or the developers who are either residents of the town or want to do development in town, to persuade them that this kind of undertaking was appropriate for it, that's going to be a very uphill climb. And I'm not sure how much benefit we'd really get from it. which in a way, I guess, suggests, as we look at the codes for our existing zones, maybe we think about pieces that could be enhanced, but trying to do this as an overall project seems like one that would just cause lots of heartburn and not give much reward from it.
John, I agree with that statement. I think this is that's why to me it's so narrowly focused on what we're looking at, and can we do it? Can we, like what Mark said, do a hybrid approach, take some of what we're learning here in this form-based idea and apply it to our existing zones, or create a transitional zone, or because this is not the only place where we're seeing the need for transitions, and that might be helpful. But I agree with you, especially watching what City of Knoxville went through, and we're 80% built out. It seems a very big, large exercise in frustration for really is certain small areas that we just really need to be sensitive about.
This is really good. Where in Knoxville is this zone?
Well, this is Mark. In the city of Knoxville, they have two form-based overlay areas that are purely form-based, and that's in Cumberland Avenue and the South Waterfront. And those, obviously both are somewhat developed, so it's a lot of infill and redevelopment, but that's where they have them currently. And then there's components of that in other zoning districts, like Noah was talking about. And that's probably the way I would approach it from the staff level, is look at what we currently have and what can we adjust, like John and Louise are talking about, with what we have to address these concerns and try to provide for more predictability by having kind of a hybrid of establishing a form in certain areas, especially areas where we're wanting to protect existing residents, and then the remainder would be treated more like traditional zoning, I guess. But and just thinking about how all of it relates to each other and within itself. So, but I think it could be done in a lot more simple ways than what these videos are conveying. And we would just need to look at it from our community's perspective and figure out again what we're trying to address, and then what are the best and easiest ways to accomplish that.
Hey, Mark, this is Scott. Yeah, I did a little additional reading on the form-based codes and some of the stuff from Mr. Perez. And I think an example of what I'm hearing too, and it's the first place I went to, is that yes, and I agree with a lot of what everybody else is saying on here, is that, we're almost fully built out at the 80%. And if an example that I came across was Lafayette, Louisiana, where they applied form-based codes strictly to their town center redevelopment project. I know Lafayette's a town of 125,000 people, 25,000, but they took that hybrid approach as well. So if anybody's interested in looking into Lafayette, Louisiana, you could find a comparison there.
That's a good point. Yep. We'll definitely would have to tailor it to our community and what our community wants, if they even want to address it in this manner. But I think providing more predictability is a general objective, I think, that would be valuable pursuing. And there's various ways that we could do that. So I think that's it for now. We'll look at the last 3 videos after the regular meeting, and I'm going to go ahead and try to get set up for the regular meeting. We'll start here in about 5 minutes.
Mark, you're still going to make those videos available to us online later sometime in the next few days.
Yeah, everything's being recorded, so I'll provide you with that. It'd probably all be on our website, frankly, but I'll find out exactly. Yep.
Sounds good, because it looks like this meeting that you're about to start could run fairly lengthy, and some of us may prefer to just watch it later.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Weren't the YouTube links for the sessions maybe John doesn't have that, but maybe just the members of the planning commission have that.
They were in the packet, yes. The links were part of the planning commission packet.
Yeah, but John doesn't have that probably because he's not on the planning commission.
Yeah, but it should be online as well. You know, the packets are typically posted on the town website.
Sounds good. I'll find it.
Yeah.
Thanks much, guys. I'm going to sign off at this point unless you need me on here for anything else.
All right. Thanks, John.
All right. We'll see you. Thanks, guys. Have fun.
Y'all able to see that screen? Everybody see that?
Yeah, I can see it fine.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. All right.
Jack, that's really loud.
Well, I can't hear it.
Trevor, you might want to mute.
Jack, it looks like Is that good? Is that good, Dad? Can I have this, Dad? Don't take that head off. Take your step out. There's rights right there. Mommy, remember that scared flag? Remember that scared flag? Huh?
I want to call the
February 18th, 2021 meeting of the Farragut Municipal Planning Commission to order. Is everybody back? And can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, good. We'll get started here in a minute with, first of all, I want to say that once again, we're following the governor's executive order in compliance with continuing the state of emergency to facilitate the response to COVID-19. So we're once again online. You can get this video online if you, and also on, I think by now I can remember all the places you can get it online, but you can get it on the community access channel at 193, I think it is, as well as the YouTube channel for the town of Farragut. Also, we'll start with Mark. You want to call the roll?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. Chairman Holliday.
Here.
Commissioner Dick.
Here.
Mr. St. Clair.
Here.
Commissioner Green.
Here.
Commissioner Russ.
Here.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Here.
Commissioner Myers.
Commissioner Myers present.
Vice Mayor Poblin.
Vice Mayor Poblin present.
Mayor Williams. Mayor Williams.
He had another meeting and he said he would probably be here for the start of this one, but
Okay. Yeah, I didn't think I saw him at the workshop. Okay. All right, so we've got 8 present with Mayor Williams absent currently.
we'll start out with the approval of the agenda, and I think you have some changes, Mark.
Yes, at the request of the applicant, agenda items 6 and 7 are proposed to be removed from the agenda. There are no other changes besides that.
I'm going to move to approve the amended agenda.
I'd second that. Ed St. Clair.
Sorry,
Okay.
Vice Mayor Poblin was moved.
Okay.
Motion.
All right, I will read a roll call vote here. Chairman Holliday.
Approve.
Commissioner Dick.
Approve.
Commissioner St. Clair.
Approve.
Commissioner Green.
Approve.
Commissioner Russ.
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Approve.
Commissioner Myers.
Commissioner Myers approved.
Vice Mayor Poblin.
Vice Mayor Poblin approve.
And Mayor Williams still not here. Okay. And the motion passes 8-0.
Item number 2 is approval of the minutes for the January 21st, 2021 meeting. Do we have any changes for that?
I do not have any.
Have a motion, please.
Vice Mayor Poblin move to approve.
Commissioner Dick, second.
Okay, Chairman Holliday.
Approve.
Commissioner Dick.
Approve.
Commissioner St. Clair.
Approve.
Commissioner Green.
Approve.
Commissioner Russ.
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Approve.
Commissioner Myers.
Commissioner Myers approved.
Vice Mayor Poblin.
Vice Mayor Poblin approve.
Mayor Williams. Okay. Motion passes by a vote of 8-0.
Moving on to item number 3, discussion and public hearing on a final plat for the Mary E. Smith property, parcel 79, tax map 142, 17.82 acres, 3 lots, zone R-1, the May and Associates applicant.
This is a piece of property that actually you all had a 2-lot subdivision approval back in 2019. And so now the applicant, they did not end up recording that plat, and now they've decided to subdivide essentially what was lot 2 on the eastern part of the property into 2 lots, around 1.4 acres each. And so with this subdivision, it does, somebody needs to mute their mic, please. I've got some background noise. Okay. This property fronts on Boring Road, and Boring Road is a collector street. So there's a couple of variances that they're requesting in relation to this subdivision that will need to be acted on separately. And they're both related to the subdivision regulations. The first variance would be a request to not construct a pedestrian facility along the frontage of lot 1, which is the large 15-acre lot. The second variance would be from the requirement for a 10% open space as part of the subdivision plat. And those two variances, as I mentioned, would need to be acted on separately. Initially, I think the applicant was going to request a variance from the sidewalk along the entire frontage, but have amended that to just apply to lot 1. So that's what the variance would be associated with. The other 2 lots would have a sidewalk or walking trail constructed prior to issuance of a certificate of occupancy for those, similar to what we would require in a regular subdivision. So in terms of the first variance request, the staff does recommend approval of this due to the size of lot 1 and the amount of frontage. It's got over 965 feet of frontage. So what the regulation is asking them to do is, from the staff's perspective, out of proportion to the effect of the subdivision in this case. Now, certainly if this tract is further divided, which it likely will be, then the pedestrian facility requirement would be revisited at that time as part of that subdivision plat review. So that's the staff's recommendation on that variance request. Does anybody have any questions with regards to that?
Mark, this is Vice Mayor Poplin, when I'm reading this, I don't know if this is the proposed plat that he's presented to us, but it says variance request, no sidewalk installation. That needs to specifically state which lot has no sidewalk installation, because.
And that's when we get to the plat itself, that's what comment 1 is talking about.
Okay. Okay.
Because they'll have to update the notes and the easement for the access easement to reflect that. So this plat is just a plat that was the latest, but not the one that ultimately would be, presented for recording.
Okay. Yeah, that's the other thing I was going to bring up is the easement for lots. Well, they're both labeled 2 right now. Lot 2 and 3 are going to have a joint access easement so that you don't have 2 driveways coming off of that.
Yeah, and they have withdrawn that variance request, so they're agreeing to line those up. Basically, the idea is to line it up with Baldwin Park's access. The value of having fewer curb cuts, in addition to better and more safe traffic flow, is that you have less interruption of your pedestrian facilities. You have fewer opportunities for conflicts and impacts to your curbing and other public improvements. So they've agreed to go ahead and do that. The plat obviously would have to plat that easement so that lot 3 would have the ability to come over and exit the property or enter the property at that access easement point that would be on lot 2.
Okay. And just for clarity, they are going to eventually have to construct sidewalks or a trail on their frontage.
Along the frontage of 2 and 3.
Okay.
The variance request is just to omit it at this time on lot 1. And then, of course, if that, as I mentioned, if that is further subdivided, then it would be revisited at that time, and it may very well, they may very well have to put the facility in across that frontage.
Okay, I just needed clarity on. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a motion on the first variance?
Yes, Ed, I would move for approval of the variance on the pedestrian facility for lot 1, based on its being premature at this time.
Vice Mayor Pavlin, second.
Okay. The motion is to approve the variance for not constructing a pedestrian facility at this time on lot 1, the 15-acre tract. Commissioner or Chairman Holliday?
Approve.
Commissioner Dick?
Approve.
Commissioner St. Clair?
Approve.
Commissioner Green?
Approve.
Commissioner Russ?
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy?
Approve.
Commissioner Myers?
Commissioner Myers, aye.
Vice Mayor Pavlin?
Vice Mayor Pavlin, aye.
Mayor Williams? Okay. All right, the motion for the variance passes by a vote of 8-0. The second variance that they're requesting is also a subdivision regulation variance, and that is to the open space requirement, 10% open space requirement. The staff does recommend approval of this variance for very similar reasons to the pedestrian facility variance. And basically, the 10% requirement is really not proportional to the scale of the subdivision that's being proposed at this time. So certainly upon further division of lot 1, the 10% open space could certainly be revisited. This is just based on, this variance would only be based on this plat and what's being presented at this time. The staff does recommend approval of the variance to not require the 10% open space at this time.
Vice Mayor Pavlin, move to approve.
Second.
Okay, is there any, who's the second on that?
I don't think we have one yet.
Oh, you didn't have a second, okay.
Commissioner Dick, second.
Okay, is there any discussion on that?
Betty?
Okay, I got it. Mm-hmm. Anyone have any questions about that, or? Okay, so the motion on the floor is to approve the variance request to not require open space, the 10% open space at this time for the subdivision proposed at this time. So Commissioner Holliday?
Approve.
Commissioner Dick?
Approve.
Commissioner St. Clair?
Approve.
Commissioner Green?
Approve.
Commissioner Russ?
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy?
Commissioner Bellamy, aye.
Commissioner Myers?
Commissioner Myers, aye.
Vice Mayor Pavlin?
Vice Mayor Pavlin, aye.
Mayor Williams? Okay, the motion passes a vote of 8-0. And now for the plat itself. The staff does recommend approval of the plat subject to 3 conditions. And as Vice Mayor Pavlin alluded to earlier, one is to update the plat notes and easements based on the action taken by the Planning Commission this evening. The second was to correct an error in the setback and buffer language, mainly on note number 8. And then the third is just to include in parentheses the old lot number and the original acreage of the parent tract. So those are all very minor subject tos, and the staff recommends approval of the plat. Does anyone have any questions?
Start
Vice
with
Mayor
the
Pavlin, I'm gonna move to approve with the subject twos.
Do we have anyone from the applicant here?
Yeah, I think Richard LeMay I saw him earlier as a participant, if he's still here. Richard, he may not be in the meeting. I'm not sure, but it's.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you now. Yes.
Okay. Yes, I'm here. I enjoyed the education about planning. Thank you.
You have any questions on these comments? Or?
No, we're good with the staff recommendation and we'll adhere to them all.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor from Vice Mayor Pavlin.
Commissioner Russ will second that motion.
Okay. And okay, so the motion is to approve the plat with those subject twos. There's 3 subject twos. Chairman Holliday.
Approve.
Commissioner Dick.
Approve it.
Commissioner St. Clair.
Approve.
Commissioner Green.
Approve.
Commissioner Russ.
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Commissioner Bellamy, aye.
Commissioner Myers.
Commissioner Myers, aye.
Vice Mayor Pavlin.
Vice Mayor Pavlin, aye.
Mayor Williams. Okay, motion passes by a vote of 8-0.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to item number 4, discussion and public hearing on a site plan approval for the Blue Cross Healthy Place Playground, 11408 Municipal Center Drive, zoned O-1, Town of Farragut, applicant.
Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Sue Stool, the Parks and Recreation Director, and she can provide an overview of this project for you all.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear
Okay.
you, Sue.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. The town of Farragut was fortunate enough to receive a grant from the Blue Cross Foundation for one of the 10 Healthy Places playgrounds that they're going to install this year in celebration of their 75th anniversary. So this playground will be located behind the town hall in the open area. It will not impact any of the trees that are there already. It's an inclusive playground in the fact that it has more than just the ADA minimum. It will actually have some ramps that will allow more access for kids and adults who might be in a wheelchair or have other disabilities. We have chosen the Thrive and Play design, and you can see, well, you can't really see because it's so small, but it includes swings, a freestanding play area, a fitness station area, a small pavilion with tables. The site will not be lighted, but we will have them install some conduit for electricity so that we can put a light into the small shelter that's there, but there will not be overhead lighting at this point. The town will also restripe a couple of the parking spaces that are right there next to it to have a dedicated handicap space right there with easy access. The plan for this is to get started sometime in the spring, and it should be completed by the end of the year.
I'm going to move to approve.
Ed St. Clair, I move to second.
Sorry, that was Vice Mayor Pavlin who made the motion.
Do you all have
I got it.
any questions for me tonight?
we're just glad that you have another grant that you've been able to secure.
Well, thank you very much. We're very excited about it.
Anyone else?
Okay, so
Questions or comments?
okay, if no one has any questions, we've got a motion and second on the floor, and motions to approve the site plan. And I'm going to take a roll call on this. Chairman Holliday.
Approve.
Commissioner Dick.
Approve.
Mr. St. Clair.
Approve.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Commissioner Russ.
Happily approve.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Commissioner Bellamy, aye.
Commissioner Myers.
Commissioner Myers, aye.
Vice Mayor Pavlin.
Vice Mayor Pavlin, aye.
Mayor Williams. Okay, the motion passes by a vote of 8-0.
Congratulations, Sue. We'll move on to item number 5, discussion and public hearing on a site plan for Horizon Plaza, 11011 Kingston Pike, east intersection of Kingston Pike and Admiral Road, Zone C-1 and FPD 6.08 acres, urban engineering applicant.
This project is at the east intersection of Admiral Road and Kingston Pike, right across Admiral Road from Premier Eye Care, which was completed a couple of years ago. I'm sure most of you all are familiar with this property. It's heavily tree covered now. It has a floodplain, a large floodplain in the north part of the property, and it drops off very steeply away from Kingston Pike as you go north into the property. The project is basically a retail office project being proposed here with the parking in front along Kingston Pike. There's a couple of variances that we'll talk about in a little bit in relation to this project, but this just kind of gives you an overview of the project. There's a right-in, right-out access on Kingston Pike that's proposed, and then there's an access onto Admiral Road that's proposed that would line up with the Premier Eye Care access. Let's go to another sheet here. You can see here on the grading plan, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it's very steep as it drops off toward the creek. A lot of grading, a lot of fill on this property for it to be developed. There's a stormwater detention area in the northeast portion of the project. So that's kind of a general. There'll be a retaining wall we'll look at here in a minute that basically is along the north edge of fill. And some other information here, drainage plan. This is what the building at this time is proposed to look like. There's a future building that may be built that's not currently part of this plan, but they're providing for it, and then potentially a future access to the property to the east so that all these properties have a cross-access easements and people can get out and through properties without having to go get on and off of Kingston Pike to travel from one property to the other, but that's not part of this particular site plan. This building is proposed to have an appearance like this. The top image is the south facing, Kingston Pike facing elevation, and then under that is the north face, which basically would be backing up to the creek area. It probably wouldn't be very visible, frankly. And then the east and west elevations that would be visible from Kingston Pike and Admiral Road. The dumpster enclosure and what it's proposed to look like, the lighting plan. The lighting, actually, they appear to be using kind of a bell-shaped fixture for the parking lot lights, which is a good touch. I think that will look nice. It's not in the mixed-use town center, but it does kind of give it a nice look that is a little less commercial looking. And this is some of the tree preservation plan. There are a lot of trees that would be removed for this project. It's a very challenging site, and so it's going to take a lot of fill, a lot of grade work to accomplish this. And this is some of the landscaping. One of the couple of site components that I wanted to get the Planning Commission's feedback on before we start talking about the variances and then the plan itself. One thing that they are showing at this time is the dumpster location is basically in this area here. So it would be facing Admiral Road, which would really be counter to architectural design standard guidance, as we try to encourage those kind of structures to be situated in less visible locations. I know the applicant can talk about they've tried to look at different locations that made sense, and they really couldn't figure out anything that would work. And so what they're proposing is to heavily landscape the area. Of course, there'll be a screen constructed around the dumpster, an enclosure that would be architecturally compatible with the building. But then to supplement that, there would be some evergreens, some arborvitae, Nellie Stevens holly, and cryptomeria that would be added around the enclosure to further hide that structure. This is kind of a blow up of where the dumpster would be situated. Let me kind of highlight that. And let's see here. It's basically here, and you can see Admiral Road. So it's pretty close to Admiral Road, but they are, like I said, planning it pretty heavily around the entire enclosure to try to screen that completely. Due to the angle, you know, it's not going to be particularly visible along Kingston Pike, and probably with the landscaping, frankly, wouldn't be very visible along Admiral Road. But that's something that the commission needs to, you know, weigh in on and understand and be okay with as a site element. And the other site element, as I mentioned, there would be a pretty sizable retaining wall on the north end of the project. And basically what they're proposing is a kind of a vegetative, it's called a terra mesh, green terra mesh growing wall that would basically look something like that. So that the face of the wall itself has vegetation on it, and basically has the appearance of a yard or whatever vegetation they end up proposing. So that's kind of what they would like to do in terms of the retaining wall element. I don't think the retaining wall is going to be particularly visible because it will be on the back side of the project facing the creek. But this is what they're proposing. So that's a couple of things to think about. And when we start talking about, I guess, the site plan itself, I just wanted to show you all that. There's a couple of variances dealing with the access that they would be requesting. And I will say that they are going to the Board of Zoning Appeals next Wednesday for a variance to not construct a sidewalk at this time along, it's about 125 feet of Admiral Road, basically in this area, due to the topographic challenges and what it would take to put a sidewalk in that would essentially terminate to nowhere. Basically, to have a pedestrian facility along either side of Admiral Road would require a reconstruction of the culvert that goes over Turkey Creek, and that's a pretty substantial undertaking. So this is a variance that was similar to what the Board of Zoning Appeals approved for the Premier Eye Care on the west side of Admiral Road a few years ago. And what they did in that case and what we'll be recommending in this case is that they have a covenant that is recorded that runs with the land that basically, if that section of Admiral Road is improved in the future, that the property owner be responsible for extending the sidewalk to their property line. So I just point that out as also there's a lot going on with this site. It's a fairly simple in some ways, but a little bit more complicated in others. There's a couple of variances, as I mentioned earlier, dealing with the access. What they're proposing on Kingston Pike is a right-in, right-out. Kingston Pike is an arterial street, and there is a requirement in the driveways and other access ways ordinance to have access is 400 feet apart and 400 feet from the nearest intersection. And this variance request is for 135 feet. That's the difference between what they're requesting and what the requirement is. We have talked about this with the town engineer, and frankly, in this section of Kingston Pike, there's nowhere you could put an access that would meet the 400-foot spacing requirement because of other existing accesses really on the south side of Kingston Pike, and you can kind of see those in a little bit in faded terms there. So staff does support the variance for the access. It is a right-in, right-out access point. It does have a deceleration lane. The applicant engineer can talk to you about why this location was selected, because we did talk a little bit about that at the staff developer meeting when this was discussed. And that might be something that that would be good to bring up. So basically, the further you move that access point to the west, or to the east, excuse me, then you get closer to this access. And so really, I think what they were trying to do was just look at all the access points in the general area and figure out where would be the best place, with the understanding that it's just a right in, right out. So with that, I will entertain any questions. I think Chris Sharp's here, and he's the project engineer. If y'all have specific questions on this variance, because we'll have to take action on this access variance and the Admiral Road access variance before we take action on the site plan itself. Does anybody have any questions? Chris, you might, if you can, you might want to just explain the logic of the access point, why it's proposed where it is, and I think they would have a better understanding of what's maybe going on here.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. The Premier Eye Care, or the Admiral Road access point, we're proposing it where it is to line up with Premier Eye Care. As far as Kingston Pike, since our first submittal, we actually moved the right in, right out to the east. And there's a requirement in the International Fire Code that basically limits a fire apparatus back up to 150 feet. So we moved the access point to the east to mitigate that requirement. So essentially, if we'd have left it where it was initially, we would have had to provide a turnaround. Basically been a large mass of asphalt that would have been unattractive and temporary, but nonetheless, it would have been an eyesore, in my opinion. We're also fighting grade going to the east, so the further east, the access point goes, the more fill is involved, and the higher the wall gets, and so on and so forth. So we feel that this location is appropriate, and TDOT has actually approved the location. So it's, I mean, as far as getting their permit, it's a matter of getting the bond in place.
Does anyone have any questions for Chris on that?
This is Vice Mayor Pavlin. I'm going to move to approve the Kingston Pike write-in, write-out variance.
Commissioner Myers, I'll second.
Okay. Is there any other discussion on this? Questions? Of course, this will have to go to the Board of Mayor and Alderman, both of these variances, after action is taken here. So motion on the floor is to approve the variance for the access for the distance between driveways and distance from the intersection for the access proposed on Kingston Pike. And I'll do a roll call on that. Chairman Holliday. Chairman Holliday.
Rita, you're not on. You're muted.
Approve.
Commissioner Dick.
Approve.
Commissioner St. Clair.
Commissioner St. Clair, aye.
Commissioner Green.
Aye.
Commissioner Russ.
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Commissioner Bellamy, aye.
Commissioner Myers.
Commissioner Myers, aye.
Vice Mayor Pavlin.
Vice Mayor Pavlin, aye.
Mayor Williams. Okay, the motion on the variance passes by a vote of 8-0. The second variance is on Admiral Road. As Chris indicated, what they're trying to do there is line the access up with Premier Eye Cares, which the staff does support that. This is a variance of roughly 57 feet. The reason, the logic behind the variance here is for topographic reasons, because it does, as I mentioned earlier, drop significantly as you go further north on Admiral Road. Does anyone have any questions on the access variance associated with Admiral Road?
This is Vice Mayor Pavlin. I'm going to move to approve the Admiral Road variance.
Commissioner St. Clair, I second.
Any other discussion on this? Okay, the motion on the floor, and second, is to approve the variance for the access proposed on Admiral Road. Chairman Holliday.
Approve.
Commissioner Dick.
Approve.
Commissioner St. Clair.
Commissioner St. Clair, approve.
Commissioner Green.
Commissioner Green, aye.
Commissioner Russ.
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Commissioner Bellamy, aye.
Commissioner Myers.
Commissioner Myers, aye.
Vice Mayor Pavlin.
Vice Mayor Pavlin, aye.
Mayor Williams. Okay, the motion on the variance passes by a vote of 8-0. The third action, and just, well, while I'm on this screen, this kind of shows, as I mentioned earlier, there's a potential future element to this, and that would be mostly kind of an office, at least what's envisioned at this time on the east side. And then you can kind of see with this where, you know, can't get this thing to right. Yep. Hold on one second here. I was going to show you basically, we're, you know, ultimately we want to have cross-lot connectivity to the east, so they're not precluding that with this project. There would be some parking, obviously it would have to be reworked, but they will plan to plat an access easement in association with the plat that would be needed for this project prior to the issuance of a certificate of occupancy that would provide for the opportunity for a cross-lot connection should the property to the east be developed in the future. So that's just one thing to note here. As far as the site itself, there are 8 remaining subject tos, and then if anybody has any questions in relation to the dumpster placement that I mentioned earlier, or the retaining wall that's proposed, I think certainly the applicant should be able to address either of those questions if anybody has any. The remaining subject tos are mostly reminders and clarifications. There really aren't but just a couple that are related to the plan itself. So the staff would recommend approval of the site plan subject to addressing the 8 remaining items.
I'll start with a question for you, Mark. Are you satisfied with the protection of the creek and floodplain?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging site. I'm a tree hugger, so I hate to see a forest be affected, but I think they've done a good job with the challenges that they have been given with this property. It is a very challenging piece of property. So, you know, I'm comfortable with what they've put together in that regard. They do comply with our flood regulations with this project.
Yeah, related to that, I guess there's still going to be a substantial tree line along the creek and on both the north side as well as even on the south side somewhat. It's not going to be cleared, I would think,
yeah.
Similar to behind, but behind Superior, Vision, there's still quite a bit of tree line behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's an aquatic buffer area there that they have to stay out of, and all their grading is staying out of that area. So yeah, there'll still be a fair amount of tree cover in the floodplain part of the property.
Anyone else have any questions?
Yes, I have a question, Mark. Who would be responsible for the installation of the access point if the property to the east develops?
Well, if the property to the east develops, then as part of the site plan review, we would require them to connect to the access point that would be provided if this second phase is executed for this property.
Okay, I guess I'm just trying to figure out, I couldn't figure out where the parcel line was. So the drive that you're showing is a separate parcel.
Yeah, the parcel line is basically through there.
Okay, thank you.
And
that's all I have.
Stonecrest Shopping Center is the property that's developed to the east. And that's what you see here. This is part of their drive aisle into the Stonecrest Shopping Center. Yep.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions about the wall or the dumpster or the building elevations or anything?
Are you comfortable with the wall? I guess I'm comfortable with it only because it faces the creek area, and it's not a wall that we're seeing from the driving from Kingston Pike. But it's not it's not a very attractive wall.
Frankly, I'm not real familiar with this type of wall. I know there's one in Gatlinburg. That there was a project that they had sent me an image of, but it was hard to see that, so I didn't really put it in the PowerPoint. But my understanding is, I mean, it's not this rock, because that's not what it's going to look like. It's this green, the vegetative element above the fence here is the type of wall that they're proposing, and it's actually on a slope. The slope really, it can't exceed 70% in general to you know, for stabilization, but we don't allow slopes to be more than 2.5 to 1. And that's what they're showing on their grading plan, is to tie that in with the 2.5 to 1 slope.
And Mark,
Uh-huh.
and Vice Mayor, actually, the wall, you can actually, from what I've read, you will see a vegetative cover on the wall itself.
Yeah.
I haven't seen one in person, but the literature I've seen, I mean, you won't actually see the wall. It'll be, you know, whatever, ivy or whatever the case may be, whatever vegetative surface is most sustainable, I guess.
And I guess that's the question, is what is that surface? What is it something that they have to maintain, or it just grows naturally and they just leave it alone?
My expectation it'll be something that grows naturally, because I mean, it would be difficult to maintain. But, you know, and I emailed Mark that, you know, we'll welcome feedback from the staff, you know, as to what type of vegetation is the most sustainable.
Yeah, I'm not really an expert on it. I mean, I know we attempted to do this at JCPenney and it didn't turn out well. At the end of Heron Road. So I'm a little, you know, not really sold on it. And certainly I don't want any invasive exotic cover in this area. So that's a big concern. A lot of times the stuff that would actually end up covering it are things that you don't want, you know, like winter creeper, for example, comes to mind. You definitely would not want that.
And if I may, again, I agree completely. So, I mean, at the end of the project, if a portion of the wall is visible, it'll be very limited, probably 100-foot stretch along Admiral Road. I don't think you'll see it from Kingston Pike unless you're just looking for it. My opinion.
Yeah, I don't think you would see it from Kingston Pike at all.
Do we need to delineate out what we don't want to see, like that we don't want to see any invasives, or is that something that we need to put on
Well, the
plan?
problem with this is I'm not familiar with it, so I really wouldn't be capable of or competent to tell them what kind of plant material to use, because it's a very kind of unique application, frankly, and it's a very challenging environment for whatever they put there to actually succeed. So I would not want to say you need to use crossvine or Virginia creeper or something like that. Those would be two native vines that you certainly could consider, but I don't know if they would do well in this kind of application or not. I mean, they may want to consult with a native plant specialist to get their thoughts on what they may apply here that would be native and achieve the visual objective.
We will. I mean, what I would suggest too. We'll consult with the actual material supplier, the wall supplier. Based on their case studies, what has succeeded, and I would hope that they have regional data to support, what has been installed and thrived in that environment. I would think.
This is Commissioner Green. While we were discussing this just now, I went over to Google Maps and did a street view looking toward that where the wall is going to be from the church area over there. And that whole creek area is a mass of trees. So I really don't think it's going to be very visible coming down Admiral Road at all. So I really don't think it's going to be an eyesore.
I'm not concerned about it from that perspective. I'm concerned about it from what Mark is saying. The last thing we need to do is introduce more invasives into our community. We're beating them back wherever we have areas where we maintain as it is, and that would be my concern, is that certainly you want it covered and certainly you want it to have something of growth on it, but you certainly don't want to be introducing invasives that take out our natural plants.
So Commissioner, this is Commissioner Green again. Mark, do we have anybody that can, as a caveat to this approval, to look at that before the planting goes on to make sure we're safe in that area?
Well, I mean, I think that would be up to the applicant to engage with a native plant specialist. I wouldn't use the industry's recommendation because they're probably going to recommend something that's very invasive, frankly. And I'm very concerned about that in that location in particular, right above your creek. So they really need to have a, discussion with someone that's an expert on establishing native ground cover in a setting like this and figure out what would need to be applied and how it would need to be applied, because it's way out of my area of expertise, and I would be very concerned about using the industry's recommendation on what to use there, because I kind of have a guess as to what they would say.
This is Commissioner Green. I would expect that we probably could get somebody from UT to help with that, no, at no cost.
Matt, may I pipe back in?
Yeah.
I think from the Admiral Road vantage point, you won't see any wall. So I mean, we could not propose any vegetation along the wall if that's a concern, which is certainly a valid concern. Mark, will you go back to the grading plan, please?
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, it's that one. If you see where the wall it turns almost 90 degrees. Right there, yes. The wall at that point is approximately 5 feet tall, with the high side being the Admiral Road side. So the creek side it'll be hidden from view, so nobody, no one will see it anyway. So I mean, if I understand the concern, we don't want invasive, species either, and nobody does, but at that point, the wall, that side of the wall won't be visible to anyone.
Well, can we make a condition that if you're going to plant it, you're going to coordinate with a, I don't know, someone from UT, whatever we need to put in that language to coordinate, so that we're at least stating that as a condition that we're not going to have invasives there. I think that we just need to make sure that I understand, Chris, where you're coming from, and I appreciate that. I just think that we need to cover our bases to make sure that that's something that we let be known on this approval.
Why don't we just make it a condition to submit a planning plan at the appropriate time?
And he has to do that through VRRB anyway as part of his landscape plan.
Yep.
Yeah.
Typically on a building this size, it'll need to be prepared by a landscape architect.
Yeah, it will. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, we could take a look at that. That could be certainly a reasonable condition to coordinate the slope and wall with the native plant specialist and submit that as part of their landscape plan.
If I may double back, I mean, is planting the wall necessary then?
Well, that's what I'm trying to give you wiggle room to say, okay, if you're not going to plant it, that's fine. But if you are going to plant it, we want, that's what I'm trying to get at, that if it does end up getting planted, that it's planted with an approved plant. So
yes, ma'am. Understood.
I mean, I would probably, Chris, if the wall is no taller than 5 feet and it's pretty discreet there, they may just want to, if they wanted to, just add some tree cover and some native trees and shrubs to kind of just sporadically dispersed across the wall, and that would probably be a better and less maintenance, frankly, approach to addressing that.
And we're on board with that.
Well, there's two things here. There's the wall and there's the slope.
Yeah, the slope.
And the slope, I'm assuming that picture is a kind of an exaggeration of the size of this slope. Is from a scale standpoint, Chris, is it?
It's a 2.5 to 1 slope, most of it. So it's a pretty
the one in the picture.
Talking about
Oh, the
No.
photograph. Yeah, that.
Yeah,
The photograph looks to me like it's more radical than what
Oh,
we
yeah,
have.
no. Yeah, we wouldn't allow a slope that steep. It would, yeah, we
But
don't
I think
allow any
it's, I
slope
think
steeper than
it's also
2 meters.
higher and steeper, isn't it, Chris?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it appears to be so, sir.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to make sure everybody understands that that's, I'm looking exactly kind of like a rendering of what this one would look like.
No, sir. Oh.
Chris, I've got a question for you. We're going to maybe change gears a little bit and talk about stormwater. I went through the plans. I noticed that you're using the under parking lot stormwater quality devices, the filtration devices in the structures, in lieu of doing like permeable pavers. And in my experience, those structures require a fair amount of maintenance to them. What was kind of your rationale? And they're perfectly legal to do so, but what was kind of your rationale of using that type of water quality philosophy versus doing permeable pavers?
Well, I like pavers. I'm a big fan of pavers. But in this case, we're handling a lot of off the street water from both Admiral Road and Kingston Pike. So I would basically have dual systems if I went the paver route. I would have my perforated system to treat the pavers, but then I've also got to install, 18-inch or, larger storm drains to handle the street water.
Okay, so you're saying since you were installing all the underground storm drainage anyway, you're kind of, that makes sense.
I was treating a smaller area with the insets near Admiral Road.
Okay.
The inserts rather.
The inserts, right? I mean, does your client, are they aware of the maintenance that needs to be, those inserts require?
I will advise them if they're not. I mean, it's basically annual maintenance.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions? Do we have any more questions for either Mark or Chris? In that case, do I have a motion?
I'm going to make a motion, but I'm going to add a seventh subject to if the wall is planted, that they coordinate with a landscape artist to avoid invasives. So I'm going to move to approve with those seven subject twos.
I'll second Louise's motion. This note, Commissioner Myers.
Okay, hold on 1 second here.
There are 8 now, right?
Yeah, we got 8 now. So
you're talking about adding number 9?
It's actually number 9, yeah. It'd be adding 9.
I'm sorry.
So that's okay. Yeah, I got it.
Amend your motion, Louise.
Yeah, 9 with the added one that mine.
Okay.
I'll second.
I got it. Yep, I got it. Okay,
Mark,
so yeah.
I was going to add one. If English ivy is not on our invasive list,
we would definitely not want that.
Yeah, because it covers and grows fast. Gosh,
Trust me, that would not ever happen if I'm here, as long as I'm here.
Well, people think just because it's called English ivy, they think, oh, it's not invasive, but it is. I battle it every year. It tries to kill a lot of trees on my farm.
Yeah, there's
no like.
Yep, we don't want that. No kudzu. Yeah, obviously kudzu would be a problem. All right, well, so that was the motion on the floor. And second for the 9 subject twos. And I will take a roll call vote on this. Chairman Holliday.
Approve.
Commissioner Dick.
Approve.
Commissioner St. Clair.
Approve.
Commissioner Green.
Commissioner Green, aye.
Commissioner Russ.
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Commissioner Bellamy, aye.
Commissioner Myers.
Commissioner Myers, aye.
Vice Mayor Pavlin.
Vice Mayor Pavlin, aye.
Mayor Williams. Okay, so the motion passes by a vote of 8-0.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Looking forward to see what you can do with that.
Me too.
So now we're back to discussion on form-based codes, part 2. Do we want to take a 5-minute break here?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's take a 5-minute break and we'll start at 8:05.
Okay. 8:05, okay.
Hey, Mark?
Mark, are we gonna
Yeah.
I know it's number 8 on the agenda. But would it be more appropriate to move that to after the 9 and 10 and get rid of the meeting, and then we're going into a training session at post meeting?
We could do that. But we don't have any items on either of those agenda items, so
that's what I'm saying. We could just dispense with that. Go right into the
if the commission wants to do that, that's fine.
Let's do that.
I move we approve the agenda to reorder 8 to become number 10.
Okay, 8 becomes 10.
I second that.
10, St. Clair and Pauline. Okay, Chairman Holliday.
Approve.
Commissioner Dick.
Approve.
Commissioner St. Clair.
Approve.
Commissioner Green.
Commissioner Green, aye.
Commissioner Russ.
Approve.
Commissioner Bellamy.
Commissioner Bellamy, aye.
Mr. Myers. Mr. Myers.
I think he left already.
He's already on break.
Okay. Well,
break.
All right. Vice Mayor Pavlin.
Vice Mayor Pavlin, aye.
Mayor Williams. Okay. Motion passes by a vote of 7-0. All right. So we'll be back in 5 minutes. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and.
Yeah, approval of utilities. We have no utilities.
We
Is that
do not have any. No.
Okay, and citizens forum, all of those were withdrawn because of the agenda items.
Right. Yes, that's correct.
In that case, the February 18th, 2021 meeting of the Farragut Municipal Planning Commission is adjourned. We will re-adjourn. We will get back together in about 5 minutes for the training.
Hey, Mark.
Hey.
It's Bart.
Yep.
I know that you were having problems getting the YouTube videos to play and share originally, but can you run those in full screen mode? It might be easier for people to see some of the finer details on some of the PowerPoint slides or on some of the presenter slides when they're going through. Like, when you turn on YouTube, if you go down to the bottom of the YouTube screen, there's usually like a tab to show it full screen.
Maybe I was just lucky just to get it to work.
Yeah.
I was very pleased that it actually.
I didn't bring it up in the first few because I didn't want to. I started to try to send you a chat, but I don't think I was successful. But
I probably wouldn't have seen it anyway. I need to find it. That's
if you turn on the YouTube again, like.
I've got to find the video.
Okay.
Try to see what I did with it. Let's see here. I don't know what I'm gonna.
You should be able to execute them right out of the hyperlinks in the packet.
Yeah, but I had it all ready to go.
Okay.
Just minimized, but I don't know what it's doing.
Well, anyway.
Oh, here it is. Yeah. Now, does that show up on the screen?
I can't see it right now. I don't think you're sharing it yet.
Okay. All right. Let me share that. Let's see here. So that's what I need to do.
Yeah, I'm still not seeing it.
Yeah, I gotta go in there. Oh, here it is. Now you can see it now. You see it now?
Yeah, I see it. If you look down in the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, over more in the very corner.
Right there, full screen.
Yeah, that's a full screen. Like
full
click
screen.
on that. Yeah, click on that for a minute.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
You see it now?
Yeah, and then to get out of it, you just hit escape.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, that's good. That looks a lot
It,
better.
it just may make it easier for people to see some of the finer detail on some of his slides.
Yeah, let me know if you hear this. I'm going to start this before they get back.
Okay.
I'm Tony Perez of Opticus.
Yep. Yeah, I can hear it.
Okay, good. All right.
It's running.
Okay. Yep.
Okay, good.
That sounds good. No, yeah, that's excellent. I didn't realize that. Like I said, I was just glad that we got it to work.
Yeah, I didn't want to mess with it in the beginning because I was like, but I think if he's showing slides with any more detail, it'll be easier to read the detail on the screen or see it a little bit better.
Hey, Mark. Mark.
Yeah.
Why were all the trees in the echo or something on the property behind Little Joe? Why were all the trees removed?
Are you eating something over there? Yeah. What are you eating?
I didn't hear what you said, Betty. Sorry, I couldn't make that out.
I'm not sure what's going on. I hear myself very good. The tree, we're on a break right now, right?
Hi, this is Amanda Miller, agent 1520. It looks like your student loans have been flagged eligible for the Forgiveness and Relief Program. However, your application needs to be completed. This applies to all loan statuses, including loans in default and garnishment. If you could please call the dedicated
That's not muted, so
at 202
that's what we're hearing.
9940. We can have this applied.
All right, everybody, please mute yourselves, please.
Ed, you need to take care of that student loan.
All right. I'll have to get back with you, Betty. I can't hear what you're saying, so I'm not sure if there's something going on in the background.
I'll call you.
Oh, okay, that's good. I kind of heard that. Let's go ahead and get started so we can wrap up these remaining videos. And let's see here. This is the fourth video in a series, and this is going to talk about building form and placement standards. So with that, we'll start the video.
Hi, I'm Tony Perez of Opticus Design, and I'm here to do the fourth segment of our form-based code series here with the City of San Rafael. And today's session is building form placement standards. They're part of the segments that we talked earlier. And this 12 or 14-minute segment goes into a little more information about this particular part of the form-based code. So thanks for joining us. So welcome back. Thank you for joining us today for this fourth session. And as you see on the screen here, there are a number of pages shown. And these are pages in a form-based code, the types of codes that we write. And you can see there are 4 pages that we're going to go through. The ones on the right and focus on the form and placement standards. Okay. So the building form and placement standards are super important because they set the basis for the form of character to be delivered, the form of character that came from your vision in the public process.
Hey, Betty, can you mute?
I thought it was.
Either that it already exists and you're making more of it, or it doesn't exist and you're from scratch. So the building form standards are important because they help not only form individual buildings, but they help form positive relationships between buildings and between buildings across the street and for shaping the street. So the first part of identifying building form and placement standards is to look at the intended physical character. And as we talked about last time in the previous segment, we talked about the physical character and uses in each zoning district. And we talked about how each of those zoning districts has its own distinct physical character, although it shares many of the same elements: buildings, streets, setbacks, streetscapes, all kinds of other elements. The difference between the numbers and the standards in each of the zoning districts is in response to the type of physical character that's intended. Bigger buildings and deeper buildings in one zone, maybe smaller buildings and bigger setbacks in another, and so on. So that information is carried forward into these standards, and we'll start with building size, footprint, and massing. And so these standards have to deal with how big and how deep does a lot have to be in a particular zoning district in order to accommodate the types of buildings and the range of buildings that are expected in that zoning district. And again, everything that's allowed / expected, you can use the same term. You know, it's all in the service of, or in the aim of, generating that intended physical character, or again, if it already exists, to make more of that physical character with every new investment. So building size, footprint, and massing are very, very key to making sure that buildings just aren't the right height, the right intensity, the right size. You know, how wide, you can see on the screen here on the right, in addition to the lot width and lot depth requirements, which are typical in a lot of zoning codes, but they're more of a minimum rather than what really fits kind of approach. And in a form-based code, it's more about the fit. And so you can see there are dimensions here for how wide buildings can be, how deep they can be from front to back, going from the front of the lot to the rear of the lot. And that has a lot to do with the kinds of relationships that buildings have with one another, and then, you know, the occupants. What's it like to be in the backyard of these buildings if one of the buildings was too long, for instance? So those kinds of standards can be put into these into this section of the code. And then in addition, massing. So it's not enough to say height and width. You need to say, well, buildings wider than X and deeper than Y have additional requirements. And so you can put those here. Building placement and setbacks is next. Understanding how big buildings can be, now we can apply standards for where do they need to be on the lot in relation to the street and to the side street and to the side yards and rear yards. Where does the building need to be in order to make the environment that's expected and to make the streetscape that's expected? So this area of the code identifies not only building setbacks, but what we call a facade zone. And the facade zone is along the front of buildings and along the side streets of buildings, and so on corner lots. And the facade zone basically works to allow the designer creativity to not just have this relentless row of building facades, you know, from one end of the block to the other, but to allow the designer and the developer to have the building not just be in a straight line. They could have it in a straight line, but it gives the option to do other things as long as that facade is in this facade zone. You can see it here in the interior lots and then here on the corner lot. And the idea is that if you place enough of the facade in that area, you're going to positively shape the streetscape every time you have a building. If you didn't put the building in there and you had a deeper setback than that, it might sound great from some type of mitigation standard approach, but it wouldn't be great for positively shaping a streetscape. The next part, let me just continue with that. you can see illustrated here, you know, this type of environment is really dependent on larger front setbacks. And this environment has large front setbacks, but they didn't really have any standards for where the building could go versus the parking. So this beautiful street that I was showing you, you can see a remnant up to the right, a beautiful house there with a front yard. It's been compromised by the standards, not really knowing about the existing character. Same with this side street in a little village Main Street kind of context. The building is in the right place to form a Main Street environment, near or at the sidewalk. And this is building, but the front isn't very clear, although the entrance, you can see it. It's been designed well with that nice covered entrance.
Haley, go.
And really no place to speak of in terms of
Haley.
ground.
Hey, Trevor, you need to mute your thing.
So and setbacks are very important. It's also related to what kind of place are you making? Are you making a place like this, or are you making a place like that? And depending on the answer to that question, the standards would correspond. Building height and ground floor height are also very key elements of this section of the code. It's not enough to say how tall buildings are allowed to be. It's more important, or equally important, to say how tall the ground floor needs to be in certain areas to maintain that character, either that exists or that you want to create. But it's also important to measure to the highest top plate. A lot of codes, or most codes, use the approach that height is bad, and certainly too much height in the wrong area, in the wrong situation, can be bad. But in neighborhoods and in Main Street areas, the best approach that we found is to measure to the highest top plate, or the highest eave, as is indicated here. And what that does is it makes sure that the building height up to that point produces realistic and useful floors. And also doesn't people trying to squeeze the overall building down into overall maximum height. As you've probably seen some pictures, look a little squatty, and that's usually because they're trying to comply with a height standard. It doesn't recognize the needs of the building that is being designed, because height has been turned into a negative most of the time. But if you measure it in this way, it frees up the building to be effective and to be designed well and not appear squatty. Parking placement, like I said in one of the earlier segments, there are so many good codes out there that do all the right things, get all the good standards in place, and then they're almost silent on parking location, parking placement. And so you get some good designs that are compromised by the parking being in the wrong place. So again, if you're trying to produce pedestrian-oriented environments, the idea is to move those parking areas toward the back, or toward at least the middle of lots, and let the buildings occupy the front and the sides on lots. So as mundane as this can sound, it's very, very important to make this clear. And then lastly, the subject of massing standards. You know, we touched on it early in the first part of this segment in the building form and placement standards, but sometimes depending on adjacencies, you want to apply additional standards. So throughout the zone, the building form and placement standards would deal with massing, as I was mentioning. But there are certain cases where maybe let's say there's 200 lots in the zoning district, but 20 of them, for example, might be in an area where they're adjacent to much smaller buildings, or usually just much smaller buildings, or different scale of buildings. Maybe they're narrower than the buildings that are in the zone that you're dealing with. And so this would be a place to recognize that without casting the standards over the entire zoning district, and simply recognizing those areas that need additional massing standards to better relate to the buildings that they're next to the buildings in another zone. So this allows you the ability, as you can see on the screen here, in the green to either do additional step backs from the front or side streets on the corner lots, or in the rears, as you can see there in the blue, between buildings that are of different height but of similar scale, or you can see on the lower right hand side where they're buildings of bigger scale, larger scale, that are presenting a rear to a neighboring, let's say, house or smaller building. So then you can see those blue areas being described in their width and height and depth. And this kind of approach lets you customize the standards further without burdening all the buildings in that zoning district with the same standard. So this concludes the building form and placement standards session, and I look forward to your questions and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is Mark. Does anyone have any any questions about that? Comments? I'm going to have to bring in the fifth video. This may take just a minute.
Hi, I'm Tony Perez of Opticos Design, and welcome to segment 5.
Is everyone good to go on to this one? Does anybody have any questions on the previous segment? Everyone still awake? Okay.
On this series about the details of form-based codes. In this segment, we'll be talking about frontage standards. So thanks for joining us. Today, we're talking about frontage standards, a very key element of form-based codes. And you can see here on this screen, the image on the left compared to the image on the right. Architecture aside, landscaping aside, you can see where the building on the left, the ground floor units here, those are housing units. Their windows are right on the street, but worse than that, there is no grade difference. There's no elevation change in elevation between the sidewalk level and the units themselves. So there's very little privacy, which is why the entire side of this building looks like this with the mini blinds pulled. Where in contrast, the one on the right has units close to the street also. They're only about 5 or 6 feet back from the sidewalk with a little terrace there, but they're elevated and they have that little hedge. And so there's this private space, albeit small, but it's in between the ground floor windows and the ground floor units and the sidewalk. So that is, in a nutshell, that's what frontage is about, providing the proper interface between the facade and the sidewalk and shaping a positive public realm at the same time. So these standards, like I said, are key to producing a public realm. They're not just about the building, and they're not about architecture. They're simply about elements that coordinate building facades on the ground floor to the streetscape. And they most often include entries. In this case, you can see examples of a porch frontage. And just to be clear, the frontage is the area between the back of the sidewalk and the facade itself. And on the ground floor, you could address the upper floors, but the upper floors are usually addressed through other types of standards in your code for facade composition or building openings. So so frontage really deals with the ground floor and how it interacts with the sidewalk. And I often just simply describe it as how the ground floor facade is attached to the back of the sidewalk. And sometimes that's with a stoop, like you see in this case of an urban neighborhood, or in the case of a lower intensity neighborhood like these houses, it could be attached to the back of the sidewalk through a front yard. This is a small front yard, but it's a front yard. And so there are all these options, these choices. As I mentioned before, a form-based code, once you look at a community, you start to see the kit of parts that make the form and character that you like and you want to continue. And so you can identify those. And in the case of frontages, these are called frontage types. And so let's go through some examples first of why this is important. We put a lot of effort on frontages, and just want to show you with some examples here. The building on this corner wasn't designed, with the corner in mind. It was simply just put there and almost avoiding interaction with the ground floor. It's like there's some kind of, bad thing happening out on the street. And so the ground floor is not even opening onto it except for this raised entry on the side street with these really kooky ladders and stairs. But the building design doesn't respond to the street, and in effect it starts to deteriorate the public realm in addition to being just a poorly designed building. Same here. This building has a lot of blank walls and besides the trees blocking the view of the street and vice versa, the building being blocked from the sidewalk. The reason for that is because the parking is on the ground floor and occupies the entirety of the ground floor, and the units begin on the second and third floors. And so, they probably thought they're doing a good thing by hiding the parking, but they're killing the public realm. Areas that are like this on the ground floor tend to be what they call dead spaces or unsupervised spaces, and not good. Or like this, where the existing character wasn't recognized by the zoning code, and so the ground floor frontage wasn't even a question, wasn't even a thing to consider. And so you can see that the strong character on this block, with the building on the right, is a characteristic of the rest of the block. And yet the zoning that was allowed here in the 60s and 70s didn't even recognize that and just put parking lots in front. And this is There's a number of problems, but primarily it's a frontage problem. And then this, it's an interesting design, but when you think about the lack of connection between the building and the sidewalk here, where this picture was taken from, the entries are not visible. And maybe you'd say, well, that's fine, they get privacy. But there's something fundamental that happens when the building is not presenting entries to the street. And you can see how that plays out on this block with the building on the right being there for a long time, a big porch, big front yard. And so the newer buildings certainly put a front yard on there, but the entries are down the side, basically near the private area of the backyard of the house that this is adjacent to. And so just a whole host of problems: building length, building size, but primarily from the street, it's a frontage problem again. And again, here's the example that we talked about earlier at the opening of this segment. They're just, very, very, these units are in a very bad situation because it's permanent. There's really no way to fix this. And that window provides light and air to those units. And it's most likely a bedroom. And it's a private area of the unit, and yet it's on a public side of the building. And it's not stepped up like you saw in the first example in the screen, or stepped back to provide privacy. Same here. It's the same situation, but better materials and maybe a little better architecture. So again, to emphasize that it's not about landscaping, it's not about architecture, it's not about materials, it's about how that ground floor does or does not interact with the sidewalk and with the public realm that it's adjacent to. So let's go through the types here. The kit of parts. You know, this diagram is trying to lay out basically from on the left the more private frontage types to the more public. And by more private, you might substitute the word privacy. That the types on the left end of this spectrum tend to be set back, and the buildings may be elevated from the ground a little bit to provide a little more separation, a little more privacy than the buildings on the right, which tend to be closer to the sidewalk for reasons of either non-residential, commercial type of businesses, or just because they're in an urban condition, and that's the character of the area. But you can see right away that one big departure from the conventional use-based approach that the frontage type approach takes is that buffers aren't a consideration here. They're not necessary. It's all about, well, where are you in the city? And that question is answered through the types of frontages that you can use. So if you're in an area of neighborhoods that value privacy and don't want a lot of interaction with the sidewalk, you don't have to put a buffer and separate the buildings from view. You just apply the right frontage type. So let's go through those. So the more public ones, beginning at this end of the spectrum, are you've seen these. They might be called different things than you maybe how you know them, but you've seen them. You've walked by them if you've been in any number of places. They involve the forecourt, which is basically it's an extension of the sidewalk. The streetscape punches in to the building. The building has a recess in it, and it has like a little courtyard in the front that connects to that sidewalk and extends the public realm. That's a forecourt. And then you're most probably familiar with the shop front here, the second one. There are a lot of varieties of this, but basically the object here is to have open windows and tall windows to let pedestrians see inside the shop, and for shoppers inside the building to see outside to the sidewalk. People like that dynamic. And then there's the terrace, which is an elevated sidewalk next to a sidewalk. And sometimes you need to do this because of the grade in certain areas, differences between the property grade and the street grade. And so this is a great technique to do that while still keeping connection to the sidewalk and the public realm. And then these two are older types that you don't see a lot lately, because a lot of cities don't allow them for concerns about projecting it into the public right of way. So in these situations, the gallery, a lot of shopping centers use them, and they're in parking lots, so they're not over the public right of way. But in older places, like this example I'm showing you right now, the gallery is in Ojai, California. And if you've been there, you know how wonderful it is to walk under that shaded gallery, and you can still look at the shops, and it gets quite hot in Ojai, so this serves a purpose, and it's an entire block long. It's beautiful. And here in the other picture on the right-hand side of the screen, this is in Riverside, California, and this is what is called an arcade, where you can see the upper story is occupied, where in the gallery there isn't an upper story. The arcade is an occupied upper floor. And so there are a lot of concerns that public works departments have over if the right-of-way is here, then allowing this to be occupied is an issue. Same with the gallery. If the right-of-way is here, then there are issues that departments have with this being out there on the sidewalk, even though the curb is here and the curb is here. So all cities have their particular standards and their reasons, but we promote these, especially in areas that would like to have them. The shoppers like to be in these environments. On the more privacy side of the frontage types, then you get to the front yard, which everybody's accustomed to seeing. They're very familiar with that one, or the porch, which is this outdoor room that's covered, and elevated from the sidewalk, from the yard, and gives an area to be out there in the front yard, a little elevated from the sidewalk, and see people walking by and just enjoy the outdoors in the front yard. So there are two types. There's this one that projects from the facade, and then there's this one called the engaged porch, which is, it's in the same plane as the facade, but it recesses back in to create this this area on the ground floor, and then this balcony on the second floor. So that's an engaged type of porch. And then there's this one that we talked about earlier on one of the opening slides, this stoop. As a building gets closer to the sidewalk, usually in urban conditions, the idea is to try and elevate that at least by a few steps, maybe 12, 18 inches at the minimum, to give the units that are close to the sidewalk a little more privacy. So that's a stoop. And then this dooryard, there are a lot of varieties of this. Some have more landscaping, some have less, like this. But you can see that here's the opening to a unit. This might be a flat, and this might be a unit above, or this might be the ground floor of a two-story unit. But there's a transition between that ground floor and the back of the sidewalk. And so in this case, somebody's using it as a shop, and this is outdoor display area, but a lot of times you'll see these used for housing. So you take all those choices and you look at the different type of zoning districts. Remember, we were talking about zoning district being synonymous with physical character, physical environment. And you look at the different physical environments that you're trying to make or continue, and you just ask yourself, which of those types best fit and support the type of character in place that we want in each of these zoning districts. And so you can see in these intent statements for each of these zoning districts, you can see that I've highlighted the different frontages that that apply to these places, these different zoning districts. So you can see in this zone, front yards, porches, stoops, and dooryards are compatible in these environments. And this one, porches, stoops, and dooryards. So we're leaving out the front yards in this particular environment because it's a little more urban. The building setbacks are shorter, and so the front yard isn't one of those frontages. In the main street, it's just the opposite. Now we're at the other end of the spectrum that we were talking about. And so we're using the forecourts, the shop fronts, the terraces, the galleries, and the arcades. And you can see how you can quickly use that kit of parts to customize the allowed selections in each of the zoning districts. Again, going back to your vision and asking yourself the question, what physical character are we trying to make or trying to make more of? And then lastly, you put those into regulations that are like these are excerpts from codes that we're writing, and you can see each of those are referenced. Here's a dooryard, here's a terrace, here's a shop front. There's 3 examples of all those types that I mentioned. And there are diagrams with standards for minimum width, minimum vertical distance from the ground, the sidewalk or the grade, minimum depth, those kinds of things. Again, this is not about architecture. It's simply saying to make these elements that attach the ground floor to the back of the sidewalk in a positive way to shape that public realm and make interesting entries and interesting ground floors. These are the basic standards. How somebody wants to design a porch, if in one area the design review board says everything needs to be of a Victorian architecture and style, then that's their prerogative. That's that community's direction. But if in that same community they say, porches in another area that doesn't have that kind of character and maybe might have a little more rustic or contemporary character, other materials would be allowed and other styles would be allowed. So these standards don't talk about style. It's simply about the configuration of these elements. So the frontages are super exciting. Of all of the parts of a code that we work on, I think this is one of the most exciting parts. And yeah, I just really look forward to hearing your questions, hearing your observations, and look, I encourage you to look in your community for these elements that we've discussed today, and maybe we can talk about them at some point. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being with us today.
Does anybody have any questions or comments on that segment? Get here to the last section. This will be the last one in the series, so the session will be over after this one, so I will start the video.
Thanks for joining us today. Today's session is about facade articulation standards, and while not a required element of every form-based code, there are situations when you want to apply these standards. So welcome to the session. Look forward to having you join us. Thanks for joining us for today's session on facade articulation standards. And as you can see here on these with these two examples on the screen, the one on the right has very detailed architecture, very historic architecture, beautiful. But what we're talking about today is not architecture. It's about the actual articulation of facades from big masses or even smaller masses of buildings and blank walls into walls and volumes that have openings and have interest. And most often that is left best to creativity by local designers. And sometimes it's a combination of that and historic patterns. So the example you see on the right is definitely a series of historic buildings with very historic architecture. But there are elements there that can be used in new buildings without necessarily using that architecture. So I just want to make it very clear, what we're talking about here today is not architectural style, rather organization and composition of facades based on either existing elements that are desired by the community or elements that don't yet exist in the community that are desired to be included. The example on the left is more than an architectural problem. You can see the beautiful one-story house on the left, the big porch at its entry, and then this two-story building, whether it's a two-unit, four-unit building or a single-unit building. It doesn't have any facade articulation to speak of, or that even is consistent with the patterns in that neighborhood. So simply, facade articulation standards are really trying to focus on the bones of the building, if you will, the underlying composition that then can be detailed in any number of architectural styles. So again, this is all about the underlying composition and organization of openings, windows, ground floor, the upper parts of buildings. That's what we're really talking about. And it's best when you look at the existing patterns in an area and take the cues from the prevalent patterns that are desired by the community and turn those into standards. So again, for those that aren't convinced, why is this important? This building satisfies, life safety, building, fire, all those codes, and actually has a nice finish of stucco on it and some nice entry doors, even a nice little canopy. And individually, the windows are pretty nice, but collectively, this is lacking because the proportion of the windows to the wall, the lack of congruity with the adjacent facades that are very, very different and have a far different pattern. This building just doesn't contribute to that existing character. Actually detracts from it. This building is actually very odd. It's a one-story low-rise building, to be sure. It has a very suburban pattern, even though it's in downtown. But the big problem here, in addition to the others, is the giant blank wall. And so there's nothing compelling these folks to change that. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed in these kinds of standards. Similarly here, this building is very thought out. The designer of this spent a lot of time thinking about that glass block and the pattern that they were trying to create and whatever message they were trying to convey through that architecture. But it isn't consistent with the rest of the block or the area that this building is located in, and doesn't contribute to that character. And so it's very different. Its composition, it's breaking a lot of the patterns that are already in the area. Same here. This actually has its sides, the building's sides, to the front of the street in most cases, and you can see some windows there on the right-hand side, but most of the windows here are on what you would call the sides of the buildings going away from the street. And that's just because of the design of the building, the design of the units, the way they're laid out. And so it's integral to unit and space design to think about the fronts and side streets of buildings that actually face the public realm and shape the public realms. As we've spoken earlier in other segments, all these things interrelate, and ultimately they either shape a great streetscape and public realm or they don't. And so these facade articulation standards are just one more element in trying to ensure that public realm is not only shaped well and positively, but that the things that are shaping it, the walls of buildings, are actually contributing and continuing the character that is important in the community. So the way to do that, in our experience, is to keep it simple. And let me go through that here with these standards. The first piece of this approach is called tripartite facade design, and it's just basically saying there are 3 parts to a facade, and that's a base, a middle, and a top. And in this section of a code, if we had 45 minutes to an hour, we could actually break it all down and just talk about this for about that length of time. But basically what you're saying is you need to express 3 parts of the building. And you can see here in this beautiful building at B and 4th in downtown Center Fell, there is a base on the building itself, the shop front that's actually stone. You can see that green stone there. That could be considered a base to that building, or you could consider the ground floor, which actually has a little intermediate band between the top of the ground floor and the bottom of the second floor window there. You can see there's a little intermediate band. That could be considered the ground, or the base, sorry. So in this diagram, that would be A. And then B is the body of the building, most of the building actually. And then C is any combination of a cornice and a pitched roof on the very top, or even sometimes the designer might take one of the top floors and connect it visually through materials or through some kind of line here, and connect it to the cornice and the roof if there's an exposed pitched roof. So there are a lot of options for how to do this. It's just a very timeless practice of breaking up facades into 3 pieces. It's thousands of years old. It comes from classical roots of design, and we've just found it very effective in organizing facades. And so this is a simple intention that can be carried out in a number of ways. The next piece of this are options for how to organize a facade. And what we do in communities is look at historic buildings, look at new buildings, and see which patterns are prevalent and which patterns of those that are prevalent are contributing to that physical character that people find great about their community. And so you can see here there are several options for organizing the facade from left to right in a number of divisions, and those divisions can be asymmetrical or symmetrical, and depending on the number of divisions, you can then organize openings and windows and stories to work with those divisions. So again, there's an underlying pattern in great building design, and the idea is to have some of that influence new building design, but not to the extent of rigidity and basically having everything be a foregone conclusion. It's simply to organize a background, if you will, for the designer to then start combining or not combining elements, but having this underlying organization that will then organize and structure the entire facade into something that has a pattern that feels characteristic of everything else in town that people hold dear. The next step is massing and composition. And once you've organized your facade, you have an underlying approach to how you want to combine or not combine the divisions and the pattern that you identify. The next thing is to identify how the building is going to be massed. Is it going to be massed toward the front? Is it going to be massed toward the middle? And the zoning standards have a lot to say about that, but there is still creativity and allowed in the standards. And so the designer then moves to within those standards to design the facade and compose the actual openings and stories and how those are expressed. And then lastly, the openings and windows are applied to that composition. So depending on the composition that the designer has chosen, there are a number of techniques for how to apply windows and openings. And you might say, well, isn't a window an opening? Well, yes and no, but there are openings that aren't windows. So that's why we use the two terms. And you can see here that there are different types of windows, different ways to detail them, different ways to express them on the facade. And these standards are not talking about any of those details. They're simply talking about the proportions of the openings, that they're typically at least square, but most often vertically oriented. And whether they're really narrow or whether they're just vertically oriented, that's up to the designer and the design review process. This is simply asking for openings to be square, at least square or vertical, to be applied. And then you can also see that there's this technique called the mansard roof, which is a really wonderful technique, and you see it in a lot of older cities, especially in Europe. Beautiful Parisian streets have these mansard roofs, and they're another story, but they're inside the volume of the roof, and so you see the pitch slope of the roof with the dormers expressed away from that pitched roof, aligning up with the facade below. And the mansard roof has really got an unfortunate reputation in the United States because of a lot of strip commercial and fast food architecture that just misused this really beautiful approach. And so this is another part of windows and opening standards that we apply, encouraging designers to take advantage of this and to give the city, especially in the downtowns where there are bigger buildings, to give that roof line and that, or that of each building and the skyline a little more interest, other than just parapet buildings, which are fine, but anyway, variety. So all these standards work together to result in buildings that have this base, middle, and top organization, have a composition that is inherent or intrinsic of the character in the area, and then have openings that reflect that as well, and can vary in architectural style and detail. And then lastly, for buildings that choose to have a corner element, or let's say that the plan and the code required certain corner elements at certain locations, then these kinds of elements come into play. And you've seen these all over the Bay Area. There are many wonderful examples of this. And so the two on the right you can see are simple, and they're single-story corner elements beginning at the second floor. Some people call those an upper story bay window, others call them an oriel. But at any rate, they are wonderful little expressions of visual interest at these corners that make the corner memorable and make the building memorable as well. And then this other one here on the left, it's actually a three-story corner element. So there are different ways to do this, and the standards allow all of these, unless for some reason there's a reason not to. There's also a version that comes down all the way to the ground and expresses the corner element down to the sidewalk. These all happen to be beginning at the second floor. So the combination of all these elements that I've shown you today are part of the facade articulation standards that aim to do more than just break up the facade, but to start to organize it and express it in ways that the community would find familiar and inviting and welcoming, that they would say, that is a facade that feels like it's part of our community as opposed to some place. So again, it's a very fine line between telling people how to design each and every building, which is not the intent of these codes, and that's not how they're detailed. But that's a big misunderstanding, unfortunately, because I think a lot of codes in the early days, 20 years ago or so, actually did that because the developers and the architects of those projects wanted that very particular result. But the kinds of codes that we're talking about today simply set up the elements and the requirements for those elements to be organized, but leave enough flexibility for the designer to still have something to do and to be creative. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for listening to this, and I look forward to your questions and your discussion with you. Thank you again for your time.
Well, that concludes the training sessions. Anybody have any last minute comments or thoughts? Everybody okay?
Mark?
Yeah.
Some of those buildings remind me of the building that's down on Gay Street that I send you a picture of every once in a while. I can't think of the name of it. But it's got the different elements of the windows, and then the side of the building, besides the windows being different than the front of the building, has some little porches also. I think Gay Street is a good example of a lot of that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's a lot of this stuff that they talk about are really is more appropriate for a more urban area. But hopefully some of the concepts that these videos kind of laid out, we could think about applying to address some issues that we've been dealing with in the town, especially in the mixed use town center. So just kind of give that some thought and think a little bit about maybe not so much all the details here, but just the general concepts and the idea of looking at the appearance, shape, the form of a building and its relationship to its surrounding surroundings as maybe a element that we could consider to help with transitions and make transitions more predictable and have less concerns from residents. So, does anybody else have any questions, comments? Well, I will log your training toward your 4 hours that you will need for this calendar year. So you all have taken a good chunk out of it tonight. So I appreciate you all sticking around for the training. And if you have any questions you think of later on, just let me or Bart know. Y'all have a good evening.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. You too, Bart.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Bart.
All right, thanks a lot.
Everybody have a good evening.